Hi, this is Krishna Iyer with the Iyer think tank in Delray Beach. I'm glad you could join us today. This podcast is again Masters of War, Latin America, and U.S. aggression from the Cuban Revolution through the Clinton years by Clara Nieto. Yesterday we discussed a good number of concepts, the most important of which was the governments of the United States, the murderous butchers of the United States government, and what they did in their anti-Hispanic campaign in Central America. Their racist terrorists of the U.S. government did mass murder in El Salvador, Nicaragua, Honduras, and Guatemala. Those were the four countries we discussed yesterday. It was a bloodbath. In two of those countries, it was, more than 500,000 to 1 million peasants were murdered by U.S. guns, bombs, and napalm. And that is what they go down as a racist group of terrorist whites that, their colonialism is fraud terrorism. That's what it is. It's racist subjugation and fraud terrorism by the U.S. government. The U.S. government are white terrorists and racists and, did all sorts of things in South America. We saw their economic results. Not an ounce of improvement in the peasant classes in Central America. It's just a story over and over repeated by history. Racist terrorists of the United States, coffer their wallets and their money and, rape and pillage the land and sulk in enjoyment of racist subjugation of the people. When they see enslavement, they are happy. That is their paradigm for economic prosperity for nations. If the people are slaves, then America is prosperous, and they are, slaves and subjugated to oppression. So that's basically it. We have reviewed those four countries. We reviewed all of the different presidents, and we'll discuss that. So again, please download the book. It will be in the description section of the video. I highly recommend you download the book. Reading the book is always best in these cases because the book gives you the most, thoughts, the most proper thoughts, the way Dr. Nieto saw the issues in Central and South America, the conflicts he saw. So I strongly recommend you read the book, but I am going to give my, viewpoint and my viewpoint. These are my viewpoints and my approach to, dissecting the information that Dr. Nieto has provided. So the Google Drive link will be in the description section. We continued with chapter 4, the backyard. The U.S. government deceitful frauds in their deceitful white press paint Franklin Delano Roosevelt, president from 1933 to 1945, as a person with an open door policy, quote unquote, who was interested in opening America up to people and business. Actually, Mr. Roosevelt was a terrorist butcher, one of a brutal string of American butchers who waged some of the most vicious campaigns in Latin America. This racist kept Rafael Trujillo in power and also was very good friends with the brutal dictator Tacho Somoza. Roosevelt was responsible for the overthrow of the democratic leader of Nicaragua, Juan Sacasa, whom he did not support. And in 1937, Juan Sacasa was overthrown by Somoza as a result of Roosevelt's murderous butchery. Roosevelt's intervention in Latin America are hardly acknowledged or discussed by the white frauds of American media or government as a way of secretly hiding his criminal actions. His most important intervention was the money and approval he gave to the murderous dictator of Cuba, Batista, who slaughtered his people and provided United States penetration of Cuba economically and took over the sugar plantations of Cuba and kept the people in a state of racist slavery. He also gave hundreds and millions of dollars in weapons to Tachado Somoza, the oldest Somoza, starting in 1933, and kept him waging war and murder against his people in Nicaragua. He is one of the most brutal butchers of the American government. We also talked about Guatemala, where the U.S. government formed a colonial slave state and starved the people with mass murder and repression, including imprisonment and fascist torture. The major president and figure in this were Eisenhower and Dulles, racist white mafia thugs with nuclear weapons that removed the only leaders who stopped slavery of the Guatemalan people, Juan Arevalo and Jacobo Arbenz, and waged a vicious military incursion against international law against the government of Guatemala. This was the effect of the end of Guatemala, as it was reduced to a bloodbath of orgy of slavery, murder, and torture by the United States government. El Salvador, we should remember General Carlos Humberto Romero in 1977 to 1979, who waged a vicious campaign against the peasants using American money and military, napalm burnings, poison, and other terrorism technology that was supplied by the white terrorists of Washington. He was funded by the racist butcher of Washington, Carter, the anti-Hispanic butcher who sliced infants into pieces with machetes and had nursing infants grabbed from mothers and thrown into the air for target practice with machine gun fire. Nicaragua, we discussed previously, and Carter was again the butcher that funded and kept the murderous assassin Anastasio Somoza in power in 1976 to 1979 and supplied him with napalm, bombs, genocidal hardware, radars, and the like. In Honduras history, we remember the massacres of Lopez Arellano, 1963 to 1971, in which Johnson backed the murderous butcher in mass murdering his people and marked the age of brutal repression, including massacres, imprisonment, political prisoners, and open murder. He maintained the people in Honduras in a state of slavery and abject misery. Again, we continue with Weapons in Hand, Chapter 5, a recount of the American butchers' wars in Latin America and repressive colonial fascism. So let's get started. We're going to read continuously. I'm going to read 40 pages because I can't go over 2 hours. So I want to read 40 pages straight. It'll put me at 2 hours, and then we'll finish with some closing remarks. With weapons in hand, revolution on the continent. The 1960s was a decade filled with hope. Most Latin American nations returned to democracy after longer or shorter periods of corrupt and brutal military dictatorships. Civilians, some well known throughout Latin America, were elected to presidencies. The Caudillos, dictators, were consigned to the dustbin of history, no longer able to depend on the support of the United States, since John F. Kennedy was vehemently opposed to the dictatorships and de facto governments. The breeze of revolution blew through Latin America. The powerful messages of nationalism, anti-imperialism, and social justice that Fidel Castro and Che Guevara sent out awakened a desire for change. Armed struggle was the answer to the inequalities, social injustices, and ever-widening gap between the rich and poor that prevailed in these archaic societies. The avenues for popular participation remained closed, and social demands were met with violent repression by the police. Armed groups with Marxist leanings emerged, eager to emulate Cuba's heroes. La Guerra de Guerrilla, Guerrilla Warfare, a handbook for armed struggle by Che Guevara, Enriquez Debray's La Revolución en Revolución, Revolution in the Revolution, became bedside reading for the leftist movements in Latin America and Havana. And Havana became a haven for the politically persecuted and for revolutionaries. Nationalist and the United States felt threatened by the Cuban Revolution. All of the large United States-owned land holdings and business had been expropriated, and the United States feared that other countries might take similar actions. Nationalist and anti-imperialist sentiments, a new phenomenon in Latin America, stretched from Mexico to Patagonia. The Cuban Revolution was not the only source of the emergence of rebellion. Following the Second Vatican Council, The new views of the Catholic Church on the needs of the poor and on social justice provided the ethical and moral basis for the people's struggle for their rights. The political debate acquired a whole new dimension. Progressive sectors of the Catholic Church, student movements, people movements, and left-wing politicians and intellectuals defended the poor and exploited masses and supported their struggle for justice. The main objective of the United States defense strategy against the revolutionary explosion was to combat the armed movements, a task entrusted to the military. The battle was directed not only at armed groups, but also at popular protests. Criollo McCarthyism in dictatorships and democracies alike labeled them as communists or communist sympathizers and fought them with equal violence. The alliance of political and economic power sectors with the military, supported by national hierarchies of the Catholic Church, fiercely defended the establishment and its privileges. The result was a growing and dangerous social polarization. The frontline fighters in the armed insurgency were the students. Most of them came from dissident sectors of communist youth movements, which had broken from the Orthodox party hierarchies opposed to armed struggle. In most countries, the guerrilla groups were rural and composed of campesinos. Only in Argentina, Uruguay, and Brazil were the guerrillas urban and led by university students and professionals, members of the middle and working class. Che Guevara's arrival in Bolivia in 1967 encouraged the armed groups of Latin America. They believed that his presence signified the beginning of a Latin American revolution. His message to the Tricontinental Conference in Havana called them to create 2-3 many Vietnams. His dream was to turn the Andes into a new Sierra Maestra. Che believed that the Bolivian Communist Party and other leftist forces would support him and that fighters from all over the continent would join the Ejército de Liberación Nacional, ELN, or National Liberation Army he commanded. The armed struggle in Bolivia will be a school in which many would learn combat, he declared. He chose Bolivia as the place to start the Continental Revolution because the country was politically unstable and had powerful campesinos and union movements. It was also a moment of strong student and popular protests against the brutal and corrupt dictatorship of General René Barrientos. Che was convinced that this explosive situation would be a veritable petri dish for the cultivation of Latin America revolutionary struggles on the mainland. From Bolivia, it could be spread to other countries. While such was Che's dream, the reality was something else entirely. The Bolivian Communist Party did not support him. Its secretary, Mario Monge, wanted to be the one to lead the political military struggle in his country. Che did not accept his leadership, calling him a traitor. Fidel knew that the party was divided, and he invited its leaders to Havana to urge unity and support of Che, but he failed. Che kept a diary in which he documented the daily development of his action. His entries included critical analysis and recrimination lists of difficulties in adverse situations. He found the terrain rough and unhealthy. He was asthmatic and did not have his medication with him. He wrote that the scarcity of food was discouraging the rebels. He further mentioned the poor discipline and low morale among his ranks. He noted the numerical superiority of the Bolivian army, but he also noted its incompetence. From the outset, the ELN was able to defeat the army with ease, costing them many casualties. In a battle in March 1967, many Bolivian soldiers were killed, and the ELN took prisoners and captured 200 weapons. At that point in time, no one yet knew of Che's presence in Bolivia. Instead of support, Che encountered fear and mistrust among the campesinos and failed to incorporate them into the guerrilla forces. Month after month, he took note of this failure, and commented that to convince them will be a long and patient task. These oppressed, poor, and illiterate masses wanted only to survive and for the government and the guerrillas to let them work in peace. Hostilities and denunciation from the peasants came later, when the army paid them to be informants. In April, the Barrientos government discovered Che's presence in Bolivia. Quickly, it began to strengthen the army using training by Green Berets and help from the CIA. Che's dream ended on October 7th. He was wounded and captured during an army ambush arranged with the aid of informers. Between 1,500 and 2,000 soldiers and Green Berets, CIA agents, and Cuban veterans of the Bay of Pigs were part of the operation. He was later killed in captivity on General Barrientos' express orders. A drunken officer dealt him the final blow. His death is a tremendous blow to the Continental Revolution, since it deprives it of the most capable of its leaders, said Castro, who nevertheless maintained that Che's death would not be the end of his theories and strategies. He remarked that Che is an example and a model of our people. Later, the Italian journalist Gianna Mini asked Castro whether Che's fight was a mistake. Castro replied that it was not, explaining that it had been Che's dream since their first meeting in Mexico in 1953 to start a revolution in Latin America and in his homeland, Argentina. Their agreement had been that Che could leave after the triumph of the Cuban Revolution. Che chose his own field of operations and he organized it down to the last detail. Castro supported Che, he added, because his decision was the correct one. Mina asked if Cuba could have done anything to assist Che in this final stage of his epic struggle. Fidel replied that this would have been impossible since the laws of guerrilla warfare were different and depended entirely upon what the guerrillas were doing. Che's diary fell into the hands of Barrientos, who sent photocopies to the Pentagon and to the CIA. He wanted to sell the rights for $300,000, but his Minister of the Interior, Antonio Argueta, secretly sent another photocopy to the Cuban government. When Cuba had established its authenticity, it published the diary with an introduction by Castro. Argueta was forced to flee the country. Barrientos declared that Che was buried in a secret location in the Andes. His intention was to keep Che's grave from becoming the site of a pilgrimage for millions of his followers. He was also determined to cover up any evidence of the cowardly assassination. Militarism rising. On July 14, 1961, the New York Times noted that Kennedy's military strategy had radically changed the concept of defense in the hemisphere. The defense and the weapons provided by the United States to the Latin American countries were now used to fight the guerrillas. Kennedy's Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, maintained before the U.S. Congress that the insurgencies were inspired by outside agitators. This strategy strengthened the national armies and Kennedy's new policies concerning the military establishments. According to an article by Edwin Martin, Undersecretary of State for Inter-American Affairs, published in the New York Herald Tribune, it not only assigned the Army control of public order, but also gave the military a role in the planning of national development. The policy bolstered the military, creating an imbalance between armies and civilian powers to the detriment of democracy. The negative effect was immediately apparent. Constitutional governments began to fall into military coups, hoisting anti-communist flags. Kennedy's defense strategy and the national security doctrine, the work of theoretician, quote-unquote, Brazilian generals, assigned to the army the task of liquidating subversion and participating as agents of change in plans of national development. A fundamental and new component of this strategy and this doctrine was civilian military projects, such as the construction of roads, schools, and sanitation facilities. Their goal was to remove the guerrillas' social base and break popular resistance to the army, whose image was one of violence. It turned out to be successful. In 1961, the United States spent $21 million on military aid to Latin America. Thousands of officers received instructions at military centers in the United States and at its bases in the Panama Canal Zone, which the Pentagon upgraded to increase their capacity for that purpose. The CIA and the FBI trained these officers in anti-subversive techniques, including ways to interrogate prisoners, which were undetectable torture practices. After the military coup against João Goulart in 1964, during Johnson's presidency, Brazil became a center for experimentation with sophisticated torture techniques taught by American agents. These methods were later applied in other countries. Officers in Latin American police and security forces received training in counterinsurgency techniques at the Inter-American Police Academy, IPA, in Panama, created in 1962. The first year, more than 600 officials from 15 countries passed through this center. That same year, the Pentagon created the Inter-American Defense College at Fort McNair in Washington, a super academy on economic, social, and military policy for high-ranking officers and carefully chosen high-echelon government officials. It also created a mobile unit of the Green Berets to reinforce its foreign military missions, which operated in all Latin American countries except Mexico, Haiti, and Cuba. And it began to recruit Latino soldiers so as to be able to send camouflage troops into Latin American countries in conflict. The era of neo-fascist dictatorships of the national security doctrine of the so-called dirty wars began after the military coup in Brazil. Most of the armed forces of Latin America adopted this doctrine. Argentina opened fire. In 1961, the candidate of the Radical Party, Arturo Frondizi, was elected president of Argentina by an overwhelming majority. Peronists, still banned, gave him their decisive support, as did the communists. He was the first civilian president after 16 years of military dictatorships. Frondizi, a leftist intellectual, nationalist, and anti-imperialist, disconcerted the country when he announced in his inauguration address that he would grant amnesty to military officers. They would not be tried for the political crimes they had committed against the people during their dictatorships. This decision was part of a secret agreement made with the generals, which included keeping the proscription of Peronism and wiping out its trade union and leftist movements. He made another agreement with Juan Domingo Perón to the exact opposite effect. Frondizi was to make concessions to the union bureaucracy and to Peronista policies, follow the economic model of the last stage of Perón's government, populist with an emphasis on development and ample foreign investment, and prepare conditions for the legalization of Perón's party. But the greatest conflict was in the area of economics. The military looked for neoliberal policies, but such policies would have come at a high social cost. If Frondizi were to adopt them, the masses would turn against him. The policies desired by the Peronistas, more in accord with those Frondizi himself espoused and that had carried him to the presidency, put him at odds with the powerful oligarchy and the military. When the economic situation began to deteriorate rapidly and labor agitation grew, stimulated by the Peronist union movements, the people had had enough of inflation and high taxes. Frondizi moved to the right. He named a neoliberal and free trade advocate, Alvaro Alzogare, to be his Minister of Finance. The military economic sectors and investors applauded his appointment. Turning his back on his anti-imperialist rhetoric, Frondizi gave in to the demands of the IMF and the World Bank, opened the doors to foreign investment, paid large sums to foreign and national companies expropriated by Perón, increased contracts with American oil companies by $1 billion. He granted them large tax concessions and gave the oligarchical elite lucrative contracts. He was also generous to the church. Frondizi's foreign policy was at once progressive, third world, and independent. He sought closer relations with Jânio Quadros, the president of Brazil. He received Che Guevara in the Casa Rosada upon Guevara's return from Punta del Este, where he had headed the Cuban delegation to the Inter-American Conference, which adopted the Alliance for Progress. At the 8th consultative meeting of the OAS, Argentina abstained from the vote to expel Cuba, and Frondizi refused to sever relations with the revolutionary government in spite of pressures from Washington and the Argentine military. Frondizi's domestic policies were repressive. Even though the Peronist movement had put him in office, he did not lift the ban on the party. He outlawed the Communist Party despite its support for him, and he put down union and left-wing movements. In 1961, he issued the Law in Defense of Democracy, retroactive by 3 to 5 years, which mandated prison for all members of sympathizers of movements and parties that are communist or might be favorable towards communism in the future. He kept the country under the Plan de Calmación Interna del Estado, CONITE's plan for the internal disturbances of the state, an Argentine version of state siege, and abolished civil liberties one by one. He allowed arbitrary arrests, torture, raids, and confiscations by the police, and he dissolved the commission named by the Congress of Argentina to investigate such abuses. He harshly controlled the press. Several newspapers and magazines were seized, and more than 30 were forbidden to publish. And he did nothing to end the activities of Nazi and other anti-Semitic groups. The internal situation began to make complications for Frondizi. The Peronists who were persecuted and turned into enemies accused him of treason. The military's opposition grew. Frondizi had never been a favorite of the military since they did not agree with his foreign policy that favored Cuba. They made demands on him and tried to overthrow him. By March of 1962, there had been 35 coups attempted, but Frondizi could not risk arresting the conspirators. Frondizi decided to make some concessions to the Peronists and their movement. He granted amnesty to some, returned confiscated properties to others, and allowed Peronists to participate in the provincial elections of 1962. But when their Peronist candidates won in some important provinces, among them Buenos Aires and Tucumán, he banned them. The military criticized this measure, declaring that he was destroying the basis of legitimacy of his government. They overthrew him, arrested him, and imprisoned him on the island of San Martin Garcia in the Plata River. No one protested. Because of the profound divisions and conflicts within the armed forces, the military did not seize power. To comply with the Constitution, the military leaders placed Jose Maria Guido, president of the Senate, in the presidency. He was a mere puppet who only signed the military's decrees. He lasted 1 year. Dr. Arturo Illia won the 1963 elections. His opponent was the former President General Pedro Eugenia Aramburu, the candidate of the military. An honest Democrat, Illia rejected the meddling of the military in politics and of foreign agencies in the internal affairs of the country. At the beginning of the term, there was peace and a stop to the fearful spectacles of military tanks driven by opposing gangs, the Colorados Reds of the right and the legalist Azules Blues settling their disputes in the streets. As promised, Illia broke with the World Bank and the IMF and canceled contracts with foreign oil companies, most of them owned by the United States. These measures proved disastrous for the country's economy. In 1965, when President Lyndon Johnson invaded the Dominican Republic, Illia refused to send troops as part of the Inter-American Force approved by the OAS in spite of pressure from the military and from Washington. Illia's politics were nationalist and with a social context, but he was forced to deal with more than 100 union strikes, protests from entrepreneurs, and efforts to overthrow him instigated by the media, as well as opposition from the military sector. Peronist factions, Peronism began to splinter at this point, unions and businessmen. They all accused him of misgoverning, inefficiency, paralysis, or moving too slowly. The planned coup against Illia in 1966 was well known and eagerly awaited by hundreds of politicians and union officials who had been either consulted or notified by the military. Illia refused to renounce his office, and the army literally threw him out into the street, hustling him out of Casa Rosada, without the slightest show of respect. The brief democratic spring came to an end. Ilya's fall was a relief to the Argentines because the country could finally emerge from the morass. They did not foresee that Argentina was on the verge of a long period of military dictatorships marked by violence and repression, nor did they predict that not one shred of their democracy would survive. Ongania's tyranny light. Although General Juan Carlos Onganía was a legalist and opposed to the coup, he believed that in working with the Constitution, when he was placed in the presidency 1966 to 1970 by the military, he decided he wanted to hold on to power, naming his government's program Revolution Argentina and declaring that it would be the responsibility of the military high command. He immediately staged a military takeover of civilian institutions. He closed parliaments, dissolved the Supreme Court, imposed tough censorship on the press, dictated anti-communist laws in accord with the Pentagon, intervened in university affairs and suppressed students, dissolved political parties, and prohibited all political activity. Someone observed that it was the institutionalization of illegality. But both a Catholic and of the pre-Vatican Council variety with a phalangist ideas like those prevailing in Franco's Spain and an anti-communist obsessed with counterinsurgency, Onganía surrounded himself with military officers, oligarchs, and fascist politicians. He imposed on the government and on society a spirit and climate of medieval piety and morality, which resulted in measures that reached the height of the ridiculous, as the Argentine journalist Mark Kaplan wrote. Ongania's dicta blanda, tyranny light, as the public christened it, brought with it political and ideologic radicalization of students, workers, and sectors of the church, and the first armed groups emerged. They were reacting to the people's discontent with the economic crisis and the subsequent growing unemployment and repression of the working class and students. This new movement from the left was willing to counter official violence with violence. In 1969, a widespread work stoppage promoted by students and automobile workers broke out in Cordoba. The protesters marched through the center of the city, burning cars and buses, the populace joining them along the way. Their battle against the police lasted almost 48 hours. Once the police had been routed, the army intervened. This Cordobozo was a milestone in the history of Argentine insurrections. For the first time, armed groups flying their banners took part in similar uprising in Rosario, Tucumán, and other cities. The government brought in many army units from Buenos Aires to put them down. These clashes left many people dead, hundreds wounded, and thousands arrested. Onganía saw these violent uprisings, strikes, and mass protests in several provinces as the work of dangerous extremist groups inspired by international communism. General Alejandro Lanús knew that the Cordobazo was not coming from subversive movements alone, but was a sign of a spontaneous expression of disgust with a government that had counted on broad support from political, popular, and church sectors. Rumors of a coup began to circulate. After massive popular mobilizations, strikes, and occupations of factories, the general work stoppage coiled by a confederation of unions, the kidnapping and ajusticiamiento execution by a court of revolutionary justice of General Aramburu of the Montoneros, and Ongania's announcement that he would impose the death penalty for terrorist actions, Lanús toppled him. The Montoneros, the ERP, and the church. In no other Latin American country except Cuba have the structures of state and society been so shaken by the guerrillas as in Argentina, wrote the German sociologist Peter Waldman. He was surprised that until 1982, there had been no study of these insurgent movements or their activities. The Argentine guerrillas appeared in June 1966 under Ongania's military government, when the junta of military commanders announced the Statute of Argentine Revolution, a series of arrangements that abolished civilian authority. The Peronist youth movement chose armed struggle as the only way to combat the dictatorship. The armed group Fuerzas Armadas Peronistas, FAP, Peronist Armed Forces, established a cell in Tucumán composed of 13 men and 1 woman. Almost immediately, the army found them, arrested them, took them to Buenos Aires, and tortured them. After the Cordobazo, other armed groups arose, the youth of the Communist Party and the Partido Revolucionario de Trabajadoras, PRT, Revolutionary Workers' Party, created the Trotskyist Ejercito Revolucionario del Pueblo, ERP, Revolutionary People's Army. This was one of the most important groups and the only one to establish an actual rural cell in the mountains of Tucumán. Like those in the rest of Latin America, the Argentine and armed movements were inspired by the Cuban Revolution. They admired Castro and were inspired by Che's presence in Bolivia. To them, his death was a tremendous blow. The FAR intended to become part of the broad Latin American revolutionary movement as an Argentine appendage to the ELN led by Che, and to return under his orders. Later came a period of ebb-tide bitterness and defeat, commented one rebel leader, and later still came the luminous glimmer of the Cordobazo, which marks a cycle of redefinition through which we completely revise our strategy and tactics and change our organizing methods. He related that members of the FAR received military training in Cuba. There it was offered with the greatest generosity. Of the 5 armed groups, 4 were Peronists, Fuerzas Armadas de Liberación, FAL, Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias, FAR, Fuerzas Armadas Peronistas, FAP, and the Montoneros, who joined the Peronist movement in 1970. After carrying out spectacular actions, these groups either joined together or disappeared. The Montoneros, the ERP, and the FAL remain the most important guerrilla groups and the greatest impact in Latin America. During the 1970s, they were at their military and political apogee, and Argentina was on the brink of civil war. The Montoneros and the ERP battled the police forces and defeated them in humiliating ways, leaving many dead and wounded in their wake. They attacked military and police barracks, some in the center of Buenos Aires, and kidnapped prominent citizens, such as business leaders, politicians, and military officers for ransom, and to issue demands to the government. Under revolutionary justice, they shot down and executed military and police officers. They placed bombs at the homes of military officers, blew up places that symbolized the government and the aristocracy, and denounced the corruption that reigned in the seats of power, both economic and political, and the regime's brutal repression. The Montoneros came from right-wing nationalist sectors and from Catholic youth associations. Some priests were militants and others sympathized. Their members were intellectuals, professionals, university students, and the children of middle and upper-class families. They ranged in age from 20 to 30, with some even younger. The majority were workers, and close to half were women. Because the women took part in almost all operations, the press drew attention to their brutality and cold-bloodedness. In 1967, an 18-year-old woman carried out one of their most audacious coups against the Buenos Aires chief of police. The Montoneros had plenty of financial resources, radio transmitters, printing presses to publish pamphlets, to falsify official documents, and to counterfeit money, scores of provisions, fleets of vehicles, hospitals, firing ranges, parade and training grounds, and even weapons factories. Their entry into the Peronist movement brought them more popular support and encouraged greater militancy. The most daring coup for which the Montoneros took credit involved the kidnapping of the former President General Pedro Eugenio Aramburu and his execution in May 1970, a deed that profoundly shook the nation. The sense of alarm grew exponentially when the police stormed a luxury mansion in an exclusive residential neighborhood, and after a violent exchange of gunfire, arrested several young people, among them a married woman who turned out to be the children of the leading Catholic families of Cordoba. A communique declared that Aramburu had been subjected to the people's revolutionary justice. He had been judged a traitor to the nation and the people for the assassination of 27 civilians, for putting 8 Peronist military officers to death by firing squad, for profaning Evita's remains, for annulling the social advances of the justicialist revolution, for the repression of the Peronist people, and for intending once again to seat himself on the throne of power, to sneer at the people and continue selling out the nation. In accordance with his judgment, we detained him and executed him. Peron, from his exile in Spain, proclaimed his solidarity with the rebels. He called them patriots and justified their action as a response to official violence. The youth movement and the Peronist armed groups supported Peron and prepared for his triumphal return. The support he gave them from exile changed as his return to Buenos Aires approached. However, he began to distance himself from them. On the day of Peron's return to Argentina, the Peronist youth movement, the Vanguardia, welcomed him with a massive demonstration, a show of its enormous mobilizing capacity. But instead of pleasing Peron, his reception worried and annoyed him. He wanted the fighting to stop, but the movement would not obey his request. He turned to the Vanguardia into enemies and subsequently persecuted them. Peron surrounded himself with right-wing Peronists and marginalized the youth movement, creating an abyss between them. In 1967, a group of young priests created the movement called Priest Movement for the Third World and joined the Peronists, attracted by the social content of the Justicialist Party. The group determined that the church could not remain neutral in the conflict between the Peronists and the anti-Peronists. So it was essentially a confrontation between the dispossessed and the powerful classes. Within a year, they had 400 members. At the beginning of 1969, the second national conference of this clerical movement brought together priests from all over the country, and the conference concluded that a revolutionary process was afoot. Many sectors believed that all peaceful avenues had been exhausted. That inescapably calls for our firm adherence to the revolutionary process for radical and urgent structural change, stated one of the group's documents, which additionally declared their rejection of the capitalist system. After Aramburu was executed, an act that implicated young men and women of Argentine high society, a journalist interviewed Father Hernan Benitez to get his opinion on this jungle law assassination. Asked if his preaching on violence was in part responsible for this assassination, the priest answered, "We are all responsible. The young people the police identified as the assassins," he noted, were of the upper middle class. Catholics who regularly attended Mass and take communion. They grew up hearing that Peronism was a plague and reacted violently against the social stratum in which they lived because of the conviction that only violence will erase social injustices. For like it or not, the privileged have never given up even one of their privileges. He added, the priests for the third world were a militant force against the dictatorship. In speeches, open letters, and manifestos, the organization protested against social injustices and political repression, and its members took part in strikes and student demonstrations. The doors of members' churches were open to student meetings. Publicly, the clergy criticized the church hierarchy for not observing the resolution of the Consejo Episcopal Latin America, CELAM. A smaller number of priests participated in the armed struggle. The regime considered such activities subversive. The military, the Vatican, after John XIII, and the powerful and reactionary hierarchy of the Argentine church, blind and mute to their grave violations of human rights, supported the military regimes and identified with the interests of the oligarchies. All these found the priests for the Third World to be a threat, accusing them of being communists. The Archbishop of Buenos Aires prohibited any member of the group from any involvement in politics and from continuing activities and preaching that touched on social issues. Refusing to follow his orders, the group broke with the church hierarchy, thus undermining its authority. Brazil and its military quote unquote guerrillas. Although Jânio Quadros won Brazil's 1961 presidential elections by the largest margin ever, his term was stormy and fleeting. He governed only 11 months. His domestic policy was a disappointment. He did not make good on his campaign promise to implement plans for social reforms and economic development. What mattered were his foreign policies, third world, leftist, and independent. He unexpectedly visited Cuba before his inauguration, a move that disconcerted and alarmed many at home and abroad. United States relations with Quadros were highly complex. President Kennedy was concerned with and irritated by Quadros' leftist tendencies and his early courting of communist nations, especially Cuba. Brazil was the Latin American power with the greatest military, political, economic, and demographic significance, and Quadros' friendship with Cuba was potentially disastrous. Quadros, unfazed by Washington's reservations about his relations with the Soviet bloc, pointed to the United States and its relations with the Soviet Union and its satellites. His policy, he declared, was to broaden foreign markets, and he feted leading communists without worrying about Washington's reaction. He decorated the first cosmonaut, Yuri Gagarin, and a high-level dignitary from the Kremlin. He also honored Che Guevara when he arrived in Brazil upon his return from the Inter-American Conference in Punta del Este. This homage to the heroic warrior was the last straw for powerful sectors of the right and the military. They believed that Quadros' policy of independence and opening to the communist world was influenced by Havana. In the midst of severe economic crisis, opposition from the military, politicians, and from the dominant classes who accused him of being a communist, he was actually a conservative, and accusations of Governor of Guanabara, Carlos Lacerda, who claimed that Quadros intended to shut down the Congress and became a dictator. Quadros abruptly resigned. It was not known or understood why he took such drastic action, though some people attributed it to his lively and unpredictable character. Congress accepted his resignation. The people remain unmoved. The military wanted to take measures to prevent Vice President Goulart, whom they considered a communist, from stepping into the presidency. At that moment, he was on an official visit to the People's Republic of China. But Goulart, political heir to Getulio Vargas, was supported by powerful popular union and student movements, liberal groups, and sectors of the military, particularly lower-ranking officers. The military command feared that a coup could provoke a civil war. To prevent this coup, Leonel Brizola, Goulart's brother-in-law and governor of Rio Grande do Sul, and Mora Borges, governor of Goiás, organized an uprising with popular brigades and the support of their respective military and police garrisons. The military, the Brazilian oligarchy, and Washington were convinced that Goulart would lead Brazil toward a Cuban-style revolution. Before he assumed the presidency in 1961 to 1964, the military imposed a constitutional reform measure that established parliamentary rule and restricted presidential power. Goulart accepted the measure and submitted to parliamentary control. But in 1963, with the support of the people, he called a plebiscite which abolished the constitutional reform, and thus he resumed full power. With the nation's profound economic crisis, it had the highest inflation rate in history. Goulart was put in the difficult position of either satisfying the working class, the source of his greatest support, or mollifying the middle class in Washington. He chose a policy of stabilization and development, which satisfied no one. The workers were upset that their wages were being frozen and their demands ignored. The dominant classes were angry with him for his inability to control the continuous strikes and protests by popular sectors, students, and campesinos who entered the political fray for the first time, and the land occupations by residents of the favelas or slums. Furthermore, Goulart had to deal with uprisings and protests by the military and by police officers. In the midst of this confusing situation, Goulart delivered an incendiary speech announcing his plans to expropriate land holdings. The big landowners of the military were furious, and the people did not give him the support he was seeking. Ousting Goulart was no easy matter, however. Powerful popular support was solidly behind him. The middle class and the landowners undertook a campaign to marshal their forces in order to prepare a climate favorable to the coup, organizing demonstrations that were clearly fascist in several cities. The March with God, for the Family, and for Democracy in Sao Paulo were attended by more than 500,000 people, most of them who were of the middle class. In the early morning of April 1st, 1964, the military staged a coup that overthrew Goulart. They justified it as a preventive counter-revolution to deter the communization of Brazil. Goulart did not resist. His passivity neutralized the fighting spirit of the people, the union movement, and the national sectors of the military, his main supporters. The streets of Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro were deserted. The discouraged masses made a few weak attempts at protest, which were put down by the new regime using extreme brutality. Later, Goulart explained that he had not wanted to call on the people to fight. He was anxious to avoid a civil war. The United States helped to prepare for the coup. Ambassador Lincoln Gordon and the military advisor General Vernon Walters, later an assistant director of the CIA, conspired shamelessly. Before the coup, American warships arrived off the coast of Rio de Janeiro at Gordon's urgent request. Enough of the middlemen, Gordon for president, was scrawled on the walls of the Capitol. Goulart had not left for exile when President Lyndon Johnson's congratulatory message to the plotters arrived. In a speech at the Brazilian War College, Gordon called the coup a defense of democracy comparable to the Marshall Plan, the Berlin airlift, the defeat of communism in Korea, and the withdrawal of the missiles from Cuba. He considered it one of the most important moments of change in world history in the second half of the 20th century. With Gordon's departure, Brazilian democracy died. With Goulart's departure, Brazilian democracy died. The military no longer respected constitutional order. The long period of the neo-fascist national security doctrine dictatorships began, launching a 21-year-long era of brutal repression. The national security doctrine, which was pressed into service after Goulart's ouster, was the work of a select group of war college officers headed by General Acervo Goldberry de Couto y Silva. From the time of its founding in 1949, the college maintained close contact with the Pentagon through a member of its military mission in Brazil. The doctrine was the guidance of the military regimes. It was the essence of anti-communism, inspired by McCarthyist doctrine. The concepts of internal security, subversion, the enemy within, and threats to the state, all included in the doctrine, were derived from United States laws. Several of de Couto Silva's theories were simply copied from Pentagon manuals. According to the doctrine, security and development, the management of the state, plans for national development, Congress, and the judiciary were all the responsibility of the military, not of a civilian society. It granted the security apparatus the job of identifying and imposing sanctions on any activity that affected the safety of the state. Communism and social ideologies were prescribed. Do Couto y Silva believed in ideologic borders and envisioned a world divided into two antagonistic sides, the democratic and Christian West and the communist and atheist East. The United States, the leader of the Western world, was to coordinate hemispheric actions, which included fighting communism and socialist ideologies. Brazil was set to be a leader on the continent of Latin America. Marshal Humberto Castelo Branco was the first president 1964 to 1967 under the national security dictatorships. He was one of the most repressive in Latin America's history. His relations with Washington attained unheard of proportions. Hundreds of advisors and technicians from the United States were placed in key positions within his public administration, as well as in the military and security institutions. The number of officials in the United States Embassy in Rio was larger than in any other United States embassy, except those in Indochina and India. Castelo Branco severed relations with Cuba, the country he considered to be the greatest threat to the hemisphere. He sent a general and a military police officer to the Dominican Republic to direct the Inter-American Force created by the OAS after Johnson's invasion of that country. He also threw the doors wide open to foreign capital, mainly American, which he provided with important resources from his country. The dictatorship of Castelo Branco was one of the most repressive in Latin America's history, with the executive decree Inquiritos Policial Militar IPM, military police, and the Operation Cleanup, both meant to rid the country of communists. Thousands of people were detained, and thousands more had their homes ransacked by the police. Castelo Branco suspended Congress for 2 years and abolished the political rights of 441 prominent Brazilians, including Kubitschek, Quadros, and Goulart. The purges in all federal structures, ministries, the judiciary, and armed forces, and the police were broad and immediate. Left-wing politicians, union and political leaders, students, priests, and the simply suspicious were arrested. Political parties, along with popular workers, campesino, and student organizations, were dissolved, and unions were controlled, and the press was censored. Works of art, music, plays, and movies that he considered subversive were also banned. From the very first day of Castelo Branco's mandates, prisons and detention centers, stadiums, and warships were filled with political prisoners to be tried by military tribunals and sentenced for crimes against the security of the state. In the first month alone, at least 50,000 people were arrested. The extended use of torture on detainees stunned and alarmed Brazilians and created a scandal abroad. It was the beginning of the Dirty War. A week after the coup, he undertook his legitimization. He decreed the first institutional act legalizing every one of national security doctrine's postulates, the military takeover of the state, Congress, and the judiciary. The generals began to expedite the passage of constitutional amendments, legislative and institutional acts, laws, decrees, and revolutions, promulgated as events dictated in order to structure the security policies of the state, reinforce military institutions, broaden presidential powers, and severely restrict civil liberties. General Arturo da Costa y Silva, 1967 to 1969, who succeeded Castelo Branco, decreed Institutional Act No. 5, the most unconstitutional, anti-democratic, arbitrary, and repressive decree in Brazil's history. It gave the president absolute power and authorized the government to dissolve Congress, suspend and disqualify its deputies, and confiscate their property. Members of the security services could not be tried, giving them complete immunity from any crimes. In cases of crimes against national security, the decree suppressed the right of habeas corpus and raised the penalties for political crimes, which included any activities that annoyed the government. Da Costa y Silva rigorously enforced this law. But just when corruption scandals linked to his government were starting to come to light, Da Costa y Silva died from a cerebral hemorrhage. Some people argue that the exposure of the corruption caused his death. According to the Constitution, the vice president, who happened to be a civilian, was to succeed him. The military ignored the law, however, and instead installed General Emilio Garistazu Medici in the presidency. The Brazilian military dictatorships were neither as firmly placed nor as politically stable as they appeared, since broad sectors of society were in opposition to them. They sustained themselves with brutal repression. The fight against subversion, mass organizations, unions, and movements and parties of the left made for a bloody manhunt. The victims were political militants, popular leaders, professors, journalists, intellectuals, students, priests, and nuns. Not even the military was exempt from repression. Nearly 10% of the officer corps was purged for ideologic reasons. Added to this macabre picture where the summary executions and many forms of torture used by the military in their detention centers during interrogations. They were characterized more by their brutality than their refinement, according to the testimony of one woman victim. Political detainees disappeared from prisons that had been converted into torture chambers, since the civilian justice system was not allowed to try military officers or the security forces. That was the job of military tribunals. They had total impunity. The military and police institutions were the most repressive organizations within the wide net cast by the state. Their invisible components were the official paramilitary groups that operated as a special security forces, death squads, whose members were former police officers, and the ultra-right terrorist organizations, Comando Casa Comunista, CCC, Communist Hunting Commandos, and the Milicia Anticomunista, MAC, Anti-Communist Militia. Each branch of the armed forces had a detention center that was converted into a torture chamber. The most sinister was the Centro de Informaciones de la Marina, CENIMAR, Navy Information Center, Department of Political and Social Order, DOPS, Operación Banderante in Sao Paulo, OBAN, and the Internal Defense Operations Center, CODI, in Rio de Janeiro, had their own torture centers too. The brutal acts of repression provoked protests from international humanitarian organizations, human rights organizations, the legal community, the United Nations, the OAS, and the Brazilian Catholic Church. The government denied their denunciations of the assassinations, tortures, and disappearances, and accused these organizations of meddling in government affairs. Officially, the government declared that no one is tortured in Brazil, quote unquote. The insurgency. The military took power violently, and they themselves paved the way for subversion, noted Carlos Marighella, a Brazilian Communist Party leader who served as the top director of armed struggle against the fascist dictatorships. In 1967, he created the Aliança de Liberação Nacional, National Liberation Alliance, ALN, one of the most powerful armed groups. The guerrilla struggle arose in response to Castelo Branco's reign of terror. During this period, an impressive number of revolutionary organizations grew out of the splinters of communist and leftist parties. In the course of the struggle, they either united or subdivided. Mobility within the insurgent movements was characteristic of the Brazilian armed struggle. The workers' movement, POLOP, gave birth to the Comando de Liberação Nacional, Colina, or National Liberation Commando, and the People's Revolutionary Vanguard, VPR, which later merged to form Vanguardia Armada Revolucionária, Armed Revolutionary Vanguard, and Ala Roja, Red Wing. These groups were composed primarily of members from the middle class, students, professionals, and former military officers. The armed struggle expanded in the major cities with terrorist actions, sabotage, bombings, and kidnappings, the capture of arms, and attacks on government institutions and American businesses. September 1969 brought the most daring and spectacular blow. A joint commando of the ALN and MRA kidnapped United States Ambassador Charles Elbrick. A female guerrilla seduced embassy guards and some of the ambassador's bodyguards in order to learn his routes and itineraries. The guerrillas demanded freedom for 15 political prisoners and their safe conduct from the country on special flight to be arranged by the government. The first kidnapping of an ambassador in Brazil, caused great consternation and humiliation for the government and for Washington. The junta, in transition after the death of Da Costa y Silva, and under pressure from the United States State Department to save the ambassador's life, immediately agreed to the guerrilla demands. The prisoners were freed and taken to Mexico, and the government published the rebel manifesto against the dictatorship in the major newspapers and broadcast it on the radio. Subsequent kidnappings of the Japanese consul general and the Swiss and German ambassadors did not achieve the desired results. On those occasions, the government did not agree to all of the kidnappers' demands, but the diplomats were nevertheless freed. After 3 years of armed struggle, After 3 years, the armed struggle began to hit rock bottom. The state's repressive apparatus captured important guerrilla leaders, among them Marighella, by means of information obtained by torture. Their capture was a severe blow to the guerrillas. Though the Brazilian guerrilla groups sometimes coordinated their operations in spite of their ideologic differences, they did not succeed in mounting an extensive and crucial an action as extensive and crucial an action as the Tupamaros in Uruguay or the Montoneros and the ERP in Argentina. Their tendency to organize into cells kept them separated, and internal conflicts, disagreements about strategy, and rivalries among the leadership weakened them. None of the groups bothered to involve the workers or the campesinos, though they counted on their support. They came to regret it. The guerrillas recognized that the reasons for their failure, some actions were launched without the necessary preparation. They underestimated the risk posed by the political and military inexperience of many of their militants, most of them young, and worse yet, they misjudged the great power of the government's repressive apparatus. There were two decisive reasons for their failure, noted the journalist Marcio Morales Alves. First were the difficulties they encountered in working underground. They were an urban guerrilla group composed mainly of people from the middle class who could not hide in the favelas, so they were easily detected by the police. The guerrillas were forced to set up centers for operation in enemy territory in neighborhoods and buildings of the big cities, where the police are able to set up a network of informers with the help of doormen and neighbors. There were continuous denunciations. The second factor working against them was torture, because of the inadequate political training of some of the militants and the fact that guerrillas did not establish strict compartmentalization. Some of them talked. The capture and torture of a student involved in an assault on a bank resulted in the loss of more than 50 operation centers in apartments, the destruction of the work of the Brazilian Communist Revolutionary Party in Rio, and the arrest of its entire leadership. The torture of two Dominican priests led to Marighella's death. Other information obtained through torture resulted in the capture and assassination of important political leaders and hundreds of revolutionaries. The CIA was behind the anti-subversive operations. Under the military dictatorship, the political, economic, and security presence and influence of the United States was open and overwhelming. The government has sold our country to the United States. CIA spies operate here with facilities equal in their own country, directing Brazilian police searches for Brazilian patriots and supervising the government's repression of the people, Marighella wrote. In 1970, the number of murdered political prisoners rose. There were indications that from 1971 on, the military made systematic elimination, quote unquote, a matter of policy. Maneiras Alves commented. The policy was responsible for the deaths of Joaquim Camara Ferreira, Marighella's successor in the ALN Directorate, Debonair Jose de Carvalho, the leader of the Tiradentes revolutionary movement, and Eduardo Leite, a commander of the VPR, among many others. Liberation Church. The generals needed the support of the Catholic Church, not only because of the enormous influence it exercised over the people, the majority of whom were Catholic, but also for its favorable image within and outside the country. Few governments were able to resist the church set against them. For General de Couto y Silva, the church was the symbol of Western culture, a bulwark against communism, and religion was a powerful weapon to control the masses. The military regime's brutal repression and grave human rights violations, however, roused the bishops to protest. Dom Helder Camara, named Archbishop of Olinda and received shortly after the coup against Goulart, emerged as the principal voice of the church against repression and for social justice. He was the first to publicly criticize Castelo Branco. In July 1966, Don Helder Camaro led a group of 15 bishops from the state of Pernambuco, Paraíba, Rio Grande del Norte, and Alagoas, the poorest regions in northeastern Brazil, in support of the manifesto of three Catholic activist groups which protested the exploitation of workers and official repression. Castelo Branco traveled to Recife to pacify the bishops, but Don Helder refused to receive him. The church and the state were on different paths. The Brazilian church was one of the first to follow the direction given to the Catholic Church by Pope John XIII and the Second Vatican Council in favor of the poor and of social justice, the pastoral and theologic renewal that spawned liberation theology. But the Vatican and its dignitaries in Latin America accused the liberation theologians of being under the influence of Marxist theories. Pope Paul VI declared that communist subversion sometimes hid under the robes of priests. His successor, John Paul II, who was even more conservative, punished the Brazilian Franciscan Leonardo Boff, one of the most distinguished liberation theologians, and imposed upon him a period of penitential silence. The liberation theologians did not deny that their social analysis was based on Marxist concepts, but they maintained this basis did not mean that they adopted Marxism as such. Ordered by Cardinal Paulo Arivasto Arns, the Archdiocese of Sao Paulo undertook a secret investigation that lasted several years to document repression in Brazil during 21 years of military dictatorships. Though the military was still in power at the time, the report was published in 1985 under the title Brazil Nunca Mais, Torture in Brazil. It documented cases of assassination, torture, and disappearance, described the methods and implements used by the torturers, identified 242 underground torture centers, and provided the names of 444 torturers. The book revealed that members of the church were also victims of the repression. Between 1964 and 1978, 488 priests and members of religious orders were imprisoned, 31 were tortured, 5 were murdered, 11 disappeared, and 28 were expelled from the country. The dirty war held on to its impunity. Before they handed over the government, the military passed a general amnesty, protecting themselves from being brought up on charges that would force an accounting of their crimes before the civil courts. They extended this amnesty to political prisoners, guerrillas, and the insurgents. In silence and oblivion, they closed this dark chapter of their history. Uruguay, a mock democracy. Uruguay, a small and orderly country with a population of 2.5 million, known as the Switzerland of South America, was an oasis of peace and democracy. The Blanco and Colorado parties alternately succeeded each other in free and fair election processes. The socialist and communist parties were neither repressed nor illegal, except for the brief dictatorship of 1933 to 1935 of Gabriel Terra, who outlawed them all. The Uruguayan legislature was one of the most advanced and progressive in Latin America. The professional army, subject to civilian oversight, respected the Constitution and did not intervene in politics, nor did the church interfere in affairs of the state. Nationalist, consistent, and vigorous economic policies with healthy regulation of foreign capital kept Uruguay less vulnerable to external pressures than the rest of the continent. The economic prosperity and political stability came to an abrupt end in 1960 during one of the worst crises in the history of Uruguay. The economy stagnated and Uruguay's image as a democratic nation began to falter as repression started to creep in with a gradual increase in militarism. Uruguay began to resemble the rest of Latin America. The country suffered inflation, recession, and the precipitous fall of the peso in 1963. Lacking reserves, the government sought foreign credits and opened the country to foreign investments, which came to control the banks and important areas of production, affecting whole sectors of the economy. Protests against this difficult economic situation by the working classes, public functionaries, and students were suppressed by the imposition of martial law. This internal agitation led to the emergence of the Movimento de Liberación Nacional Tupamaro National Liberation Movement, which evolved into one of the most important guerrilla movements on the southern continent. In 1966, General Oscar Justito of the Colorado Party won the election by a narrow margin. Constitutional reform restored one-man rule, the government having been administered until that point by a governing council in which the parties had been equitably represented. The powerful union movement, banking, industrial, and commercial employees were unionized, was controlled by the Communist Party, and had the capability of paralyzing the country. The strikes by the unions and public employees to protest the slashing of wages, high unemployment, and the housing shortage were massive and ongoing, as were student protests against repression. These demonstrations were put down by force. For the first time ever, one of the most egalitarian societies in Latin America was confronted by virulent class conflicts because employers refused to talk with the workers and to address their justified demands. Uruguay was drawn into the orbit of the IMF and agreed to its demands. Foreign capital and American transnational companies invested in key industrial and financial sectors. Foreign debt skyrocketed. The surrender to foreign capital and the consequent loss of autonomy was harmful to many economic sectors. Only the agricultural exporters and financiers tied to foreign capital and the monopolies were satisfied. The sudden death of President Justido in 1967, he had been in office only a few months, brought Vice President Jorge Pacheco Areco to the presidency 1967 to 1971. He was a corpulent former journalist and boxing fan, and like his predecessor, a member of the Colorado Party. Pacheco Areco increased the dependence on foreign capital, increasing the friction between economic and political sectors who gained from it and those who stood to lose. Responding to the general discontent, popular protests, the radicalization of the lower middle class sectors, and prestigious intellectuals who were favorably inclined toward the popular struggles and guerrilla activity, Pacheco Areco declared a permanent state of siege. He proceeded to lead the country into a de facto dictatorship, which the people called a constitutional dictatorship. Pacheco next strengthened presidential power. His Congress did not object. Invoking martial law, he banned leftist parties, alleging that they intend to destroy the present regime by means of armed struggle. He closed newspapers, imposed press censorship, and prohibited union activities and student movements, which he severely repressed. The strikes and popular and student demonstrations ended in violent confrontations with the police and the price of death, wounds, and arrest. Those who were detained were also tortured, and hundreds of job losses. He ordered the occupation of university campuses without regard for their autonomy, and he intervened in the curricula, expelling professors for ideologic reasons. The Tupamaros held that president was exercising an unnecessary repression with the sole aim of maintaining a bourgeois democracy that was a mockery. The government's abandonment of constitutional and democratic principles was received with a surprising degree of apathy and political community. When the deputy tried to bring a legal action against Pacheco for the arbitrariness and illegality of his procedures, he found no support in the Congress. Amid the turmoil, corruption flourished in the government and among small financial groups which tried to enrich themselves through frenetic and deceitful speculations and monetary conversions. They exchanged large sums of Uruguayan pesos in Argentina and Brazil for pesos and cruzeros. Prominent figures were involved in monetary devaluations caused by these groups and denounced as fraudulent by the director of the Bank of the Republic. The rapid enrichment of these groups contrasted sharply with the increasing impoverishment of the middle and lower classes. In June 1968, real wages were down by 47% compared to the 1961 to 1966 norms. In 1964, the Uruguayan peso had an exchange rate of 16 to 1 United States dollar. In 1968, it had fallen to 250 to 1. The cost of living jumped 100% in June 1970, and 6 months later to 118%. From 1967 to 1968, overall production was only 0.3%, lower than Haiti's, the lowest in the Southern Hemisphere. The general discontent could be measured by the enthusiastic way that people supported the action of the Tupamaros, which shook the power structure while the police forces had not been able to touch them. In 1969, the government passed a law forbidding the press to report on the guerrillas. The media were not allowed to mention the name of the Tupamaros or use 7 synonyms for the guerrilla. The papers avoided this decree by using such terms as the unnamables, the seditionists, conspirators, or those who take the name of the Inca Tupa Amaru. Uruguay's friendly relations with its powerful neighbors, Argentina and Brazil, were nerve-wracking and almost a matter of survival. The colossus to the south, under military dictatorships, also confronted with powerful insurgent movements, kept their eyes on development in Uruguay, ready to intervene. They believed that a Tupamaro victory was possible. Brazil's concern for Uruguay was reflected in the sheer profusion of news coverage. When the Tupamaros kidnapped the Brazilian consul Alocio Diaz Gomes and the American agent Dan Mitrione in Montevideo, Brazil mobilized troops on the Uruguayan border. The troop presence alarmed the Uruguayan people. Pacheco Areco energetically protested this intervention, but the Uruguayan press reported that Pacheco had asked the Brazilian president, General Garastazu Matigi, for aid in the form of troops to fight the guerrillas. The government of Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay knew that the guerrillas were making a mockery of their security systems and offering one another aid across the borders. Military sources maintained that the Tupamaros brought together the principal leaders of South America's armed movements in Montevideo in a coordination meeting between the Montoneros and the Tupamaros, who became co-conspirators in Aramburu's kidnapping and assassination. The collaboration between the Argentinian, Brazilian, and Uruguayan security services to capture activists and opposition figures who had taken refuge in other countries was undeniable. In 1967, a Brazilian student arrested in Uruguay tried to commit suicide by slashing his wrist to keep the Uruguayan police from handing him over to the Brazilian political police, DOPS. There were frequent denunciations of foreign agents for having participated in interrogations and torture sessions of political prisoners. The prisoners who were blindfolded recognized them by their accents. Showed us the way. One day in 1965, the Uruguayan populace was surprised and the security forces intrigued when they saw the word Tupamaros scrawled on the walls of Montevideo. Shortly thereafter, they learned from terrorist actions, propaganda, and denunciations in public places that the Tupamaros were a guerrilla group. Their official name, the Movimento de Liberación Nacional Tupamaros, led by Raul Sendic, had a long political history of organizing workers and peasants, becoming a new phenomenon in Uruguay. The Tupamaros had been preparing for battle for more than a year. Their militants, both men and women, were students and professionals from the middle class and the landholding community. Some of them were the sons and daughters of powerful families, and most were Catholic. As they grew, so did the militancy of the lower classes. The center of operations was in Montevideo. At first, they were more or less inconspicuous since the country's attention was focused on the presidential election. The country was experiencing social and union agitation because of the economic crisis, which led many to favor the guerrilla struggle. The Tupamaros consolidated the movement, armed their fighters, and began to assault banks, steal weapons, and engage in armed confrontations with the police. At the beginning of 1968, the movement launched its first-scale large offensives. In August of that year, the kidnapping of Dr. Ulysses Pereira Reverbal, the president of the Union de Trabajadores Estales and the Bankers Association, brought the Tupamaros more prestige. In a communique, they denounced the corruption of bankers and financiers, the fascist repression of the unions, students and sections of the populace, and the politics of surrender to the United States Capitol. They warned that nothing will go unpunished. The people's justice would act in ways that are fitting and suitable. According to them, Pereira was detained as an appropriate representative of the regime. They indicated that Pereira had never been called to account for the murder of a young newspaper vendor whom he had ordered for selling the daily that had accused him of being gay. Because of Pereira's connection with the government, he was released from captivity after a short time. But before the guerrillas released him, they had to ascertain whether the state's forces respected the integrity of the Tupamaros under arrest. The police could not find where they were keeping Pereira. The Tupamaros will let him go when they saw fit. The Tupamaros, protected by the silent but unwavering sympathies of many Uruguayans, moved quickly and quietly, mocking the police blockades. They applied their own brand of justice, trying and executing both officers who were torturers and corrupt bureaucrats. They also carried out raids on banks and financial institutions in order to withdraw funds, and they obtained documents that they had provided to the press. They raided the Casino San Rafael in Punta del Este for 55 million pesos and took 6 million from the Monte Financial Company, publishing its books to expose crooked and fraudulent operations involving prominent members of the financial sector and the government. The courts were forced to act and to confirm the truth behind the Tupamaro accusation. The Minister of Finance subsequently resigned. The attack on the French-Italian bank and the demonstration of its fraudulent dealings irreparably damaged its reputation, almost putting it out of business. The Tupamaros made the Uruguayan banking system tremble. By 1970, official estimates had the Tupamaros with close to 3,000 activists and 4,000 sympathizers and a solid infrastructure which could not be easily dismantled. The most daring of the actions took place in July 1970 with the simultaneous kidnapping of United States security agent Dan Mitrone, Brazilian consul Dias Gomide, founder of the ultra-right movement tradition, Family and Property. Two senior officials from the United States Embassy, one escaped, the other was released, and Cloud Fly, an officer of the United States Corporation rumored to be a CIA agent. The kidnappings had a serious impact at home and abroad. A communique of the Tupamaros accused Mitrone of being a United States spy placed by the Uruguayan government at the heart of the state security apparatus, who had admitted being a technical consultant to the Montevideo police. They published photocopies of his identity papers, including his FBI credentials. They alleged that he was an agent of imperialist repression, disguised as an aid advisor, whose functions was to teach methods of terror and torture, something he also did in Brazil. Mitrone's theory on torture, they said, dictated that a police officer is not much good if he kills because he loses his informer. The Tupamaros demanded the release of 50 guerrilla fighters, followed by all political prisoners, more than 300, among them 30 women, who were to be flown to Algeria, Mexico, or Peru. But the capture of Raul Sendix, head of the Tupamaros, along with other leaders, changed the rules of the game. The government refused to exchange Mitrone for the political prisoners in the belief that the Tupamaros were powerless without Sendix. Washington refused to negotiate. Like Pacheco Areco, the United States believed that the movement had been decapitated and that the Uruguayan government would launch an offensive to dispatch it altogether. The government's refusal to negotiate led to the execution of Mitrone. His corpse was found on the morning of August 10th with 4 bullet wounds from guns of different calibers. The incident was told by Costa Gavras in the movie State of Siege 1980. The government decreed a period of national mourning and continued the raking operation, this time with the assistance of 100 Brazilian policemen. The Tupamaros released the other hostages. Cuban Revolution was primary inspiration for the Tupamaros, since it was the first socialist revolution carried out by the non-communists. They deeply admired Che Guevara as they did the Colombian priest Camilo Torres Restrepo for his Christian conception of revolutionary struggle, declared Urbano, a Tupamaro leader who was interviewed by the Cuban press agency Prensa Latina in the 1970s somewhere in Montevideo, infested with bayonets. He added that the trail Che blazed in is revolutionary consciousness with which authentic revolutionaries would follow. He spoke of taking power with the people to achieve a socialist revolution. The Tupamaros were nationalists and anti-imperialists, but their fight to the death was against government corruption, powerful national and foreign economic sectors, and the class enemy in the bourgeois apparatus and its agents. Their objective was to improve a lot of the dispossessed and to free Uruguay from dependence on foreign powers. Their hard, daring, and successful fight spanned 6 years. Many of the Tupamaros were murdered, brutally tortured, or disappeared. But the dead you have killed are in good health, assured Urbano. Pacheco Areco gave full discretionary powers to the armed forces to combat the subversion, and these acted with furious violence, shooting to kill for the first time in Uruguay. There were systematic tortures, disappearances, and shooting of students. But in 4 years, the government did not succeed in defeating the activists. The failure was due to incompetence, to the guerrillas' skill, and to the protection provided the guerrillas by broad sectors of the populace, making their capture immensely difficult. We probably all know something who is a Tupamaro, but what happens is we don't know that he is one. What counts in the long run is the people's support, these normal, peaceful people above suspicion. They are the stream where the movement de liberación nacional, National Liberation Movement, fish swim, observed an Uruguayan intelligence officer. The green light Pacheco Areco gave the military paved the way for a coup. The military did not hold positions in his government, but it was the power behind the throne. Juan Maria Bordaberry, his successor, also a tool of the military, authorized the most brutal repression to liquidate the guerrilla movement. The dirty war spread and became more intense, and he allowed the military to govern. Later, the military removed him. Colombia, democracy and violence. Colombia entered the 1960s under the government of 1958 to 1962 of Alberto Lleras Camargo, head of the Liberal Party and the first president of the National Front, of which he was the architect. The alliance between the two traditional parties, the Liberal and Conservative, sought to end the violence against the Liberal Party in 1948 by the conservative hegemonic dictatorships and continued by the military rule of General Gustavo Rojas Pinilla. The death toll in that period, known as the violence, was close to 500,000, most of them campesinos. A consequence of this violence was the emergence of armed groups whose purpose was to defend their lives and their families. The National Front, approved by a huge majority in a national plebiscite, succeeded in establishing political peace between the parties, but not in ending the violence in the countryside. The most important guerrilla groups laid down their weapons by accepting the general and unconditional amnesty decreed by General Rojas Pinilla in 1953. But the government did not keep its promise to grant them lands and respect their lives, and the army kept killing them. Many of them returned to the mountains to continue the struggle. Rojas Pinilla's amnesty was extended to the army and the police, the perpetrators of the violence whose crimes would remain unpunished. The situation created enormous mistrust and resentment, not only among their victims, but throughout the country. Like Lleras Camargo's main intent was to bring peace by political and social measures. Amnesty and rehabilitation became the prevailing slogan of his government. He used this theme to attract those who continued the armed struggle. In 1959, he offered a second amnesty and set in motion programs of social assistance, community development, and communal action. The amnesty was to be extended only to those people who were seeking peace and rehabilitation, as verified by the authorities. Individual prosecutions remained open and could be brought back to court in the event that the person returned to violence. It was not an amnesty that pardoned and forgot, like Rojas Pinilla's, but one of liberty and watchful assistance. However, the negative legacy of Rojas Pinilla's amnesty was still fresh in people's minds and caused Lleras' offer to fail. The memories of the murders of guerrillas amnestied by Rojas also lingered undiminished, among them the assassination of Guadalupe Salcedo, the most distinguished figure among the liberal guerrillas of the Llanos region. His corpse was riddled with bullets, the result of a police ambush in the capital. At the end of the legal term of Lleras' amnesty in 1959, the violence grew more acute in a vicious cycle of harassment and military abuses against the civilian population and confrontation between guerrillas and the army. In January 1960, in different parts of the country, the army badly assassinated 3 popular guerrillas who had been amnestied. And in 1963, after an intense shootout between the army and his band, the famous guerrilla Chispas from Tolina, who had been granted amnesty by Lleras, was killed. continuous harassment by the army, which accused him of numerous crimes and called him the country's #1 bandit, had forced Chispas to renew his struggle and caused the government to place a juicy reward on his head. In the end, many refused amnesty offered by Liras since they found his guarantees insufficient, suspicious, and deceptive. Several of those who accepted the amnesty returned to the mountains after the army continued to harass them. Others took up the struggle again because they could not adapt well to civilian life. Some turned to vandalism and common crime. The government's inability to stop the violence, an impossible task in such a short time, served as the central argument of the political debate against the Liras. The conservatives accused him of tolerating what they called independent republics, 5 zones controlled by communist guerrillas movement, which they argued were breaking up the national sovereignty. Rojas Pinilla was unable to recapture these zones. In 1965, the communist guerrillas became the Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias de Colombia, Colombia Armed Revolutionary Forces, which in a span of 40 years would spread to nearly 50 guerrilla fronts around the country. Frustrated by the continuing violence, political sectors demanded that the army get rid of the guerrillas, who were by then referred to as bandits. Many, nevertheless, were alarmed by the brutality of the army, which was engaged in a sort of punitive war against the people, accused by the army of being guerrilla supporters. The army was killing campesinos, raping their women, burning their huts and crops, and stealing and killing their animals. The violence had reached new levels. The narrow range of democracy of the National Front, its bipartisan hegemony, and alternation in power prevented participation by the other political parties was the source of growing popular discontent and student rebellion. The people sought new paths. Workers' unions emerged. The Confederación Socialista General de Trabajadores, General Federation of the Socialist Workers, which was stimulated by the Colombian Communist Party, and the General Federation of Workers, CGT, which was promoted by the Christian Democrats, whose goal was to break the monopoly held by the official trade union confederations, the Federation of Colombian Workers, CTC, and the Union of Colombian Workers, UTC. New parties also formed: the movement Liberal Revolutionary Movement, MRL, a dissident faction of the Liberal Party led by Alfonso López Michelson, and Frente Unido, United Front, created by the young priest Camilo Torres Restrepo, Popular Alliance, and NAPO, created by Rojas Pinillo, and the Workers, Students, and Campesinos Movement, MOEC, a political military movement of non-communist students. The MRL, which opposed the alternation of power in the National Front, was the most significant new development in the political scene, traditionally dominated by the liberal and conservative parties. The MRL represented major defection, politically and numerically, within the Liberal Party, initially called National Recuperation Movement. It later changed the term recuperation to revolutionary, which was then fashionable in Latin America. By February 1960, the group's proposals had become more radical. Its members spoke of nationalizing natural resources, genuine agrarian reform, and support for the Cuban Revolution. Young liberal politicians and leaders joined the MRL. They were eventually joined by the popular and guerrilla movements, which were attracted to its political positions. Within the MRL, 2 factions emerged. The more flexible one, led by López Michelson, sought to replace the liberal leadership monopolized by the so-called traditional bosses with new people who could count on popular support to achieve revolutionary reforms within the constitutional framework. The other faction, the hardliners, consisted of the youth revolutionary liberal movement supported by the Communist Party, and popular sectors warned revolutionary change and people power. The MRL penetrated rural zones with campesino membership campaign that offered to protect insurgents under its banners. Surprising numbers of campesinos and armed groups supported the MRL as a tactical ally in electoral campaign. The MRL, though it was not to Lopez's liking, since he was not eager to get mixed up with communists or to take extreme positions. The MRL made electoral alliances with the Communist Party illegal from 1949 to 1969, though this was not to Lopez's liking, since he was not eager to get mixed up with communists or to take extreme positions. To the United States State Department, Alfonso Lopez's capricious leftist ideas were a threat to implied communist participation in the activities of the MRL. The United States feared that Lopez would divide the Liberal Party and set in motion a popular movement that will ultimately be taken over by the communists. Roy Rubottom, Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs, made a marginal note on a confidential document from the embassy in Bogota that Lopez should be discredited. Around the same time, Julius Caesar Turbay Ayala, Laris's Camargo's chancellor, offered Washington his cooperation in dealing with the problem of communism in Latin America. The Cuban Revolution, the problem of communism in Latin America, of China, the Vietnam War, the independence of Algeria, and the new direction of the Catholic Church under John XIII all became incentives for the drastic reevaluation of and change in the ideas and goals of the Colombian armed struggle. The partisan movement of the 1950s were events of the past. The Cuban Revolution, the 1960s brought the rise of several armed groups whose struggle was both military and political. In 1960, there was the Movimiento Obrero Estudiantil Campesino, Worker, Student, and Campesino Movement, MOAC, and from an internal schism in MOAC arose the Armed Liberation Forces, FAL. In 1961 came the pioneer group, Colombian Revolutionary Army, ERC. In 1962, there was the National Liberation Army, ELN, a pro-Castro group created by university students. In 1965 came the Colombian Armed Revolutionary Forces, FARC, the oldest campesino communist guerrilla movement in Colombia, originally organized in the 1950s against political violence. In 1964, People's Liberation Army, EPL, was born out of a division within the Communist Party. Some of these groups tried to involve remnants of the guerrilla movements in the 1950s. With negative results, their goals were different. The enrollment of the priest Camilo Torres into the AELN in October 1965 surprised and alarmed both Colombian society and the church. A man of culture, educated in the Catholic University of Lovena and a member of the prominent family, he was the first priest to take up arms against the establishment. His drastic step grew out of his frustration with his inability to convince the backward-looking and reactionary hierarchy of the Colombian Catholic Church that the people were suffering great injustices, misery, and poverty, that there had to be a change, and that the church had a responsibility to bring it about. The church sanctioned him, and he submitted to the restrictions it imposed. But he was convinced that his duty as a Christian was not to turn his back on social problems and conflicts, as the high officials of the church did. He recognized that solutions to social conflicts were impossible to obtain in Colombia through the limitation of legal avenues. He joined the ELN because his members shared in his goals. He was killed by the army. News of his death had a tremendous impact nationally and throughout Latin America. Camilo became a major figure in the calendar of Latin American revolutionary saints. In Colombia, many priests, nuns, and lay people were sympathizers and involved in the work, a proselytism directed to the ELN, although they were not organically part of it. Arrested two ELN activists, Rafael and Felipe Camilo, in our Comandante because of what he did, not only as a priest, but also as a revolutionary. His investigation, his studies, his leadership of the United Front, his life in struggle go far beyond the priesthood. Members of the armed movements and the JMRL received military instructions in Cuba. By the 1960s, the Colombian guerrilla movement was in full swing. Colombia and Cuba. No country in Latin America was more determined to oppose the Cuban Revolution than Colombia under the government of Lares Camargo. But he did so without making public pronounces. Privately, he commented John Cabot, the United States ambassador, that Fidel's triumph was as if a bandit known as Mariachi had become the president of Colombia. He added that it would be a long time before Cuba recovered from the effects of the revolution, believing, as Washington did, that the current regime was a transitional phenomenon. Lares Camargo employed great prestige in the upper echelons of Latin American society and was highly appreciated in Washington. He was the architect of the Organization of American States and served as its first Secretary General. Washington always consulted him because of his knowledge of the problems of Latin America. The paranoia inspired by revolutionary Cuba convinced governments throughout Latin America that the succession of small, unsuccessful attempts to invade Panama and Caribbean countries, which had their starting points on the island, were evidence of Cuba's intention to export its revolution and destabilize other nations. The Cuban government denied all responsibility for such incidents. After investigating the invasion in Panama, the OAS exonerated Cuba of having instigated it. Fulgencio Lecaria, a Colombian ambassador in Havana, told his government that the movement of arms in the Caribbean is undeniable. A Cuban warship had confiscated a large number of weapons from the schoons in Nautilus, which was sailing toward an unknown destination. And Central American exiles in Cuba continued their nebulous preparations to invade their respective countries. Lecaricus had asked the chancellor to send him a couple of detectives to serve as his eyes and ears and to mingle with the people and places his position did not allow him to frequent and where the Colombian community in Cuba had no access. This community is no good to me, he claimed, since it consisted of a bunch of nuns and delinquents. The Colombian press reported that Samuel Moreno Diaz, Rojas Pinela's son-in-law, was planning an invasion of Colombia in cooperation with Che, and that he intended to bring 400 Cubans to reinforce the Colombian guerrillas. Washington consulted with Liris Camargo about convening the consultative organ of the OAS to study the situation in the Caribbean and Cuba's alleged exportation of its revolution, and about Colombia's hosting the meeting. Liris agreed to the conference but suggested that it meet in Washington. Ultimately, it was convened in Santiago, Chile in 1959. Turbay Ayala, the Chancellor of Colombia, was chosen to chair this fifth consultative meeting. Washington failed to win a condemnation of Cuba. Lara's government collaborated with Washington in setting the agenda for the seventh meeting of the consultative organ in San Jose, Costa Rica in 1960. Again, Cuba was the focus for having accepted Soviet military aid offered by Khrushchev. Oddly, the word Cuba never appeared on any document from this meeting. Once again, Cuba was not accused. Fidel responded to the San Jose Declaration with the first declaration of Havana, in which he condemned the miserable submission of traitor governments and imperialism. Lares felt that Fidel was offending the government and cut off relations with Cuba shortly before President Kennedy arrived in Colombia for an official visit. When Turbay Ayala explained to his Congress the reason for the break, it was immensely unpopular among the people. He noted that many countries had beat Colombia to the punch. These nations were the Central American and Caribbean dictatorships in Peru, whose president, Manuel Pedro y Ugarteche, was a member of the Peruvian ultra-right. After Fidel's 1961 declaration on the socialist nature of the revolution and after the Bay of Pigs fiasco, Kennedy was even more determined to put an end to the revolution than Fidel. He gave the green light to CIA's Operation Mongoose and mobilized his diplomatic corps to organize Cuba's expulsion from the OAS and to apply sanctions. Once again, Colombia led the political moves against Cuba and proposed at the OAS that the consultative organ be convened under Article 6 of the Rio Treaty. The article referred to military aggression, which did not apply in this case. Nevertheless, the majority supported the petition. Chancellor Turbay traveled from capital to capital seeking support. The agenda for this meeting was set in an exchange of visits between State Department officials and the Colombian Chancellery. By an irony of fate, Turbay's tour was interrupted when his plane was hijacked and forced to land in Havana. Fidel went to meet him at the airport. At that moment, Che was with the Cuban delegation in the Inter-American Conference in Punta del Este, Uruguay. When he learned of Turbay's forced arrival in Havana, he burst out laughing. At the 8th consultative meeting in Punta del Este, Uruguay in February 1962, Cuba was expelled from the OAS. The 6 most influential Latin American nations abstained. In Colombia, as in the rest of Latin America, the measures taken against Cuba were met with violent protests, demonstrations, and stoning of the United States Embassy and burning of its flag. Valencia's pacification policy When Guillermo Leon Valencia, the second National Front president in 1962 to 1966, was elected, the guerrilla movement in Colombia was on fire, and the United States policy of counterinsurgency was in full swing throughout Latin America. Valencia and the military were determined to get rid of the bandoleros, armed groups left over from the violence of the 1950s and the guerrilla movement that had been ignited by the heat of the Cuban Revolution. No Colombian government fought the insurgency harder than Valencia's. He opened the door to intervention by the Green Berets. In 1962, a mission arrived in the country to train and advise the army. The army undertook a pacification campaign with search and destroy missions, and from that point on, civilian military actions were put into practice. Both methods were new to Colombia. The Pentagon also initiated the LASSO Plan, Latin American Security Operation, a brainchild of the Pentagon that involved the Army in internal security and national development plans. General Alberto Ruiz Novoa, the Minister of War and veteran of the Korean War, Colombia was the only Latin America country that sent troops, was an asset to the Pentagon. He put into effect his own LASSO Plan, a faithful copy of the Pentagon's plan, and indoctrinated the armed forces with anti-communist ideology. Many had already been indoctrinated at American military bases in the United States and Panama. In 1962, his army mounted the so-called campesino defenses in the conflict zone. They became a new factor in the violence. In 1965, General Ruiz Novoa mounted an extensive operation. It was not the first against Marquetalia, a zone controlled by the communist guerrilla movement led by Manuel Marulanda, known as Tio Fijo, Deadeye, to prepare the people psychologically and break down the campesinos' resistance to the army before attack. Ruiz Novoa organized civilian military actions, the construction of roads, schools, and health centers, and the supply of medicine, clothing, and food. The army demanded that the town be evacuated, but many of its inhabitants stayed. Then came the attack in which 1,500 soldiers of the battalion Columbia Brigade took part. Because they were Korean War veterans and had already experienced a real war against the communist enemy, they employed the same tactics in Marquetalia. They strafed the town with helicopters and fighter bombers and launched 5-ton bombs to annihilate the guerrillas. The action was a prolonged war of skirmishes, ambushes, and firefights in which both sides inflicted casualties. The army, with its 15,000 men, took the town. The army turned the military takeover of Marquetalia into a memorable event. It celebrated with an open air mass in the mountain, attended by the military high command, cabinet ministers, and high-ranking government officials, and an equally solemn ceremony in the capital. The army symbolically represented the Marquetalia free of bandoleros to President Valencia. Nevertheless, the army had not fulfilled its primary objective of destroying the guerrillas and capturing Tiro Fijo, on whose head a 50,000 peso reward had been placed. The guerrillas took to the mountains, and the communists retained military and political control of the zone, resting the army's relentless aggression. After the Marquetalia experience, the communist guerrillas organized themselves as military groups, which was the origin of the Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias de Colombia, Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, which was established in 1965. The zone continued to be surrounded by the army, and Tiro Fijo still kept to the mountains, and moving along secret paths cleared by the Indians, he came and went unseen. On several occasions, the army announced that it had eliminated the guerrillas, but after every blow, the guerrillas seemed to come back stronger. In spite of the military operations, with assistance from the Green Berets and many casualties, the army failed to defeat them. The end of the 1960s. By the end of the decade and over of the course of 3 shared governments, all alternating the presidency between the two parties, the National Front had consolidated peace and erased the political ideologic barriers between liberals and conservatives. Their common struggle targeted subversion and guerrillas. The conflict between the Liberal Party and the MRI also disappeared when Lopez Michelson, its leader, accepted the post of Minister of Foreign Relations in the government of Leras Restrepo. The MRL lost activist and political importance, and the opposition weakened. The movement and parties of the left splintered and turned themselves against one another, and thus were never able to transcend a minimal level of importance in the political arena. The MOAC fell apart under hard blows. The FAL and the ERC, Ejercito Revolutionary de Colombia, disappeared, and the ANAPA, the centrist populist party created by Rojas Pinillo, failed to attract the masses, but the Communist Party retained control of the Sumpaz and the Viota zones and the southern part of Tolima. The FARC broadened its fronts, and the pro-Castro ELN and the EPL consolidated their forces, but they had no meaningful military or political strength, nor were they a threat to the government. The counterinsurgency stagnated. 20 years later, a retired general maintained that neither can the army defeat the guerrillas, nor can the guerrillas defeat the government. In 1970, the ANAPO candidate Rojas Pinillo came close to winning the presidency, but he was defeated by the conservative candidate, Misael Pastrana Barrero, by a ridiculously narrow margin. According to members of ANAPO and many prominent voices, the government robbed Pinillo of his victory by means of an electoral fraud. As a reaction to this event, in 1973, young members of the ANAPO created the Armed April 19 movement, the first urban guerrilla movement in Colombia. From the beginning, it aroused great interest and sympathy among the people in intellectual and leftist circles. Peru, the decline of oligarchy. When Manuel Prado y Ugarte took office in the 1960s, Peru was in the midst of a severe economic crisis and extreme political and social unrest. General Manuel Aldria was forced to call for elections in response to popular pressure. The nation was at the boiling point. The people who fought for 20 years for political opening and the democratization of the country. The rightist military dictatorships had ended, and the country was undergoing a transformation. Students, the people, and an impoverished lower middle class were becoming radicalized, and a powerful people's union, student, and campesino movement, which demanded change, was gaining strength. Strikes over wages and salaries were constant, and the conflict over land in the Sierra reached unprecedented heights. The most serious occurred in 1959 and 1960 in Casa Grande and Paramanga, two large sugar refineries on land owned by American Copper Corporation and by the Torre Blanca Hacienda. These conflicts ended in combat with the police and the government supporting the owners and the foreign company. Prado came to power through an alliance with Haya de la Torre, head of the Alianza Popular Revolucionaria Americana, APRA, the most important political party and the one most deeply rooted in the masses. The alliance, which was called Convivencia, coexistence, was mutually beneficial. Haya de la Torre wanted to become legitimate and forge paths to power. The APRA wanted stability after shifting back and forth between a legal and illegal status decreed by various military and oligarchic governments that persecuted it. Fearing APRA's popular strength, it was a constant, often bloody struggle. Prado and his supporters in the oligarchy believed that they needed APRA at their side. Haya de la Torre agreed to abandon his radical positions in exchange for government programs and measures that assume a just income distribution and wider social benefits for the general masses. Haya de la Torre was a nationalist rather than a communist. His political life was a prolonged series of ups and downs. He was always either on the verge of being elected president or in prison or exile. The military prevented his election victory by engaging in electoral fraud. APRA members rejected the alliance with Prado and the oligarchy. Student and middle-class sectors resigned from the party and created APRA, Rebeldy, and later the Movement of the Revolutionary Left, MIR, an armed group. Other sectors joined the Popular Action Group, the party of Fernando Belaún Terry, the Christian Democrats, the Social Progressive movements, and the Resurgent Communist Party. Although APRA lost strength and Haya de la Torre lost prestige, it continued to be the major political force in the country. For the first time, the campesinos, popular and marginalized masses, enter the political arena under the barrage of banners of nationalism, anti-oligarchy, and social reform. They asked for agrarian reform, housing, employment, fair wages, education, and healthcare, all basic needs, and their just demands were supported by military circles, students, and the church. Sectors of the oligarchy were also in the process of change. The presence of shanty towns in the capital were a source of worry to the upper and middle classes. They saw that this poverty, contrasting sharply with the luxuries of Lima as a latent threat, and the programs for social assistance were insufficient to close this breach. For the first time, the major daily newspapers owned by members of the oligarchy dealt with social themes and recommended changes. Government measures in favor of the United States Transnational International Petroleum Company and the rise in gasoline prices caused a bitter political debate in the Chamber of Representatives against the IPC for the nationalization of oil and in defense of national sovereignty. Popular and student demonstrations sporting anti-imperialist slogans demanded the same, as did sectors of the military and the church. The topic was the central one of the decade. In 1962, the APRA candidate Raul Haya de la Torre won the president's election by 14,000 votes. Voluntarily, his opponent, the oligarchy and the military, alleged that his victory was fraudulent. Within a week, just before Prado left the presidency, the military staged a coup. A military junta 1962 to 1963 took power, announcing that it would restore order to the political and social unrest convulsing the country and find solutions to the problems derived from an unjust society, since repression could not solve the people's problems. The junta did, in fact, initiate important social measures, passing an agrarian reform law, legalizing campesino land takeovers, and recognizing their de facto control of lands they occupied. But it insisted that the land must be paid for, a demand they never met. Nevertheless, the junta suppressed the campesinos and the Sierra to maintain law and order. After a short time, it called for elections as promised. The junta stepped down with glowing reputation for having realized important reforms and having kept its promise to relinquish power. Fernando Voluntari defeated Haya de la Torre and served as president 1963 to 1968. He offered reformist measures, brought new people into the government, and promised a solution to the problems with IPC within 90 days. The nationalization of oil had been one of the central themes of his campaign. The people saw Belende a promise of renewal, and change. In the first 90 days, he presented executive order on agrarian reforms, but Congress, controlled by majority alliance between the APRA and the Union Nacional Ordista, Odista National Union, UNO, founded by the former dictator Manuel Odria, modified it so as not to affect the interests of powerful national and foreign landowners. Their properties remained intact. The reforms were applied only in conflict zones in the Sierra. Campesinos and indigenous people awaited Belande's fulfillment of his pledge to solve the land problem. The government sent commissions of experts in agrarian reform, cooperatives, and state loans and social investigators to the Sierra with the mission of attending to the people's demands. The problem was not resolved. In mid-1963, in all the departments of the Sierra, with the exception of Puno, there was a wave of violent land occupation under the slogan Land of Death, in which approximately 300,000 campesinos, collective farmers, sharecroppers, and workers participated. The activists were put down harshly in actions that sometimes ended in bloodbaths. The campesino movement gained strength with the support of students, retired military men, and lawyers who helped to create collective and union organizations. Belande's government lost support and prestige in broad segments of the population for failing to implement the presidential campaign's promises. The people responded with violence to an unforeseen 44% currency devaluation and to his failure to resolve the IPC problem. Armed groups such as MIR and ELN formed during Belande's government and became active in the Sierra. Belande swore he would eliminate them. It became public knowledge that Belande held secret negotiations and reached an agreement with with IPC. The IPC was to hand over oil wells in exchange for a cancellation of a debt of about $200 million. Some claim that some was $600 million, and the promise that the IPC would modernize and expand its installations. The government granted it a concession of 1 million hectares for new oil exploration. Its monopoly on gasoline would continue for 40 years. Political leaders confirmed that the agreements were damaging to the national interest and that Bondi had hidden important elements from them. His party, Popular Action, withdrew its support. APRA washed its hands of him, and the influential daily El Comercio attacked the president and asked that the army take the situation in hand. The government collapsed in a profound crisis of legitimacy, caught up in this scandal and in another involving widespread smuggling, in which members of Congress, high officials, and members of the armed forces were implicated. It was high-level corruption, Bolandi's deception of the country, and the behavior of the congressional majority, who, for very political reasons, blocked important social reforms and mismanaged public funds were too much for many, especially for the military. They shared an anti-oligarchy sentiment, which was catching hold of the country and assuming enough power to effect changes. On October 3rd, 1968, General Juan Velasco Alvarado overthrew Bolandi and deported him to Buenos Aires. The insurgency of the 1960s. Peru's economic and social situation was the cultural medium for insurgency in the revolutionary armed struggle. The society was semi-feudal, and the majority, illiterate campesinos and indigenous people descended from the Inca, were stuck in miserable poverty, completely abandoned and exploited like beasts of burden by bosses and landowners. On the other side of the social scale was the dwindling class of the would-be aristocrats and anti-democrats, owners of extensive lands and control of the principal economic sectors and the major newspapers, whose enormous influence played an important role in the country's destiny. With the support of student sectors of the middle class and the lower middle class, the campesinos and the workers continued to organize unions. Higo Blanco, a disciplined Trotskyite, emerged as the main figure of the campesinos and indigenous movements in the Sierra, where he had gone to further the movement. With the help of Cuzo lawyers, these activists began to ally themselves with Workers' Federation of Cusco, controlled by the Communist Party. Bianca warned the campesino union movement to become a democratic force that could confront the power of patrons, masters, and caminales, bosses. He did not intend to encourage a revolutionary struggle for power, so he claimed from prison in 1964 because he considered it to be premature. His goal was to solve the land issue, to defend the campesinos and indigenous people in their occupation of lands, and to protect them from the army, the boss, and the landowners. Alarmed by the campesino uprising and the land occupations, the landowners, the bosses, the Lima press, the mouthpiece of the oligarchy, asked the government to impede their further organization. The press began to sound alarm about Hugo Blanco's work in the Sierra. In 1963, under Ballond, most of the campesino and indigenous leadership were arrested in large-scale offensives against the campesino movement. Nevertheless, the struggle continued. Populist trends gained strength and won a political position. The response to these conflicts, which more than once arose within the transnational corporations, was violent repression, resulting in many deaths and wounded. In spite of the repression, student, popular, intellectual, and leftist forces, more radicalized every day, continued to fight for political democratic openings. The Chinese-Soviet ideologic contest at the time produced the well-known political ideologic controversies and the splintering of the parties on the left. These schisms gave rise to armed groups. From the APRA came the Committee for the Defense of APRA Principles and Internal Democracy, the rebel APRA, and later the MIR, Movimento de Insurrección Revolucionaria, and the Revolutionary Vanguard. And from the Communist Party came the FIR, Left Revolutionary Front, and the ELN, National Liberation Army. The pro-Castro ELN was composed of students, intellectuals, politicians, communist workers, some campesinos, and organized in cells. Its political focus was a popular government, the expulsion of foreign monopolies, an agrarian revolution, national sovereignty, and good relations with all other nations. The ELN was infiltrated and subject to desertions and denunciations. From its ranks came the army's best former informers and the guerrillas' worst enemies. In 1965, the army provoked a confrontation with the ELN that proved disastrous for the guerrillas. MIR was always in crisis, with internal polemics, struggles, and fights, and with ill-conceived strategies, according to Hector Bahar, one of its activists. Although its numbers were too few, it attempted to create three fronts in order to force the army to disperse. But the army's superior numbers, it had 50,000 men, allowed it to wage war on several fronts at once, soundly defeating the guerrillas. In spite of conceptual, political, and strategic discrepancies between the ELN and the FIR, both made a vain effort to unite and coordinate their actions. Without realizing it, both fought more or less simultaneously against the same target. The MIR and Blanco were also unable to overcome their differences. A negative factor in the Peruvian insurrection was the behavior of the New Left, public infighting, the lack of coherent ideological and political proposals, and the failure to study the complexities of Peruvian realities caused it to fall apart, wrote Bahar. Discord and unity also existed in the campesinos' organizations, making them more vulnerable to the army's depredations. Politically, the situation on the left was no better. In July 1961, there was a call to unity. Juan Pablo Chang and an unaffiliated group created the Asociación para la Unificación de la Izquierda Revolucionaria, Association for Unification of the Revolutionary Left, APUIR, with the goal of forming the only revolutionary party with the organizations and parties of the left. It was to offer strong support to the campesinos' struggle and to Hugo Blanco, who continued without political support in the Sierra. The parties ignored the call. The few who did support Blanco failed to give him what he most needed: money, men, and weapons. In 7 months, the intense combat, the army scattered the armed movements, destroyed the fronts, and imprisoned their most important leaders. Many guerrillas, disillusioned with the left, went over to the enemy's side, making the army's job that much easier. So just give me a second. I'm going to just take a 1-minute break. I'm glad you could join us today. Okay, we're almost done, just about 10 pages. The Latin Nazarites. In 1968, General Juan Velasco Alvarado and a group of officers secretly prepared for a coup against Belandi. When Velasco Alvarado took power, 1968 to 1975, he negotiated with the High Command. He announced that the revolutionary government would be a coalition of the armed forces led by a revolutionary junta made up of the oldest and highest ranking generals. He chose his cabinet from the highest military hierarchy. The military officers of the revolutionary government were progressive nationalists, anti-imperialist, and anti-oligarchy. They were called Nazarites because of this tendency, so different from the continent's military dictatorship. Though not repressive, the government did keep order by force. It did not include popular sectors in the government, but it did provide them with political participation through cooperatives and communal and union organizations. It gave land to campesinos and rural workers for use in association. The political parties continued to function, but they carried little weight with the government. The government did not touch the press, though it nationalized it in 1974. The government ended the long period of alliance between the military and the oligarchy, which lacked political strength for the first time. The lower and middle classes were the new forces entering the political scene. It was a revolutionary event since it generated a class change, wrote the historian Peace Garcia. The Nazarites were also a new kind of military class, different from the one that had ruled the country's destiny for the previous 20 years. They began to modernize, purging the ranks that were not in line with their principles, and educated themselves at the Center for Higher Military Studies, CAEM, established in 1956. There, the officers received scientific education and studied national problems. The center's goals was to form cadres to execute the plans for national development and foreign policy in order to modernize the country and strengthen Peru in the international arena. Most members of the officer corps were of the middle class and well aware of the inequality in Peruvian society. They knew the extent of the people's poverty and the government's abandonment of popular and campesino masses. They understood that it was this situation that caused the general malaise throughout the nation, as well as the insurgency. They understood that repression was a dangerous path to take. The diagnosis of the country's situation was pessimistic. Peruvian underdevelopment was more acute than in neighboring countries. Real power was in the hands of landowners, agricultural exports, bankers, and foreign corporations, for the most part owned by the United States, whose interests were generally not those of Peru. The nation had to plan a new course of development. In 1969, the powerful press underwent its first frontal assault from the government when the latter tried to control it. The editorial directors of the leading papers accused Velasco of being a communist and of attacking private property, and then strongly criticized his agrarian reform. 5 years later, Velasco nationalized the press. The government monopolized the management of the economy, the huge agro-industrial concerns, foreign commerce, and the banking industry. In 1969, it passed the Agrarian Reform Law to give land to campesino and indigenous people and to broaden the production of foodstuffs to stop the currency drain. It expropriated large national and foreign-owned estates and privatized private enterprises with the Industrial Reform Law, converting them into mixed enterprises, implementing a system of workers' co-management based on the Yugoslavian model. The nation applauded the expropriation by armed force. It took 6 days of the IPC petroleum complex, as well as the nationalization of industrial plants, sugar refineries, chemical plants, paper plants, and the United States-owned Certo de Pasco Corporation, with its great reserves of copper, tin, gold, and silver. Such support lent the government substantive legitimacy and allowed it to advance its programs for changing the economic structure to centralize its management. The intellectual and political power middle class supported the government, and some of its members held important positions. The policies invited the United States' displeasure. The government was concerned that the United States would apply sanctions as it had done with Cuba, but Washington in turn worried that similar treatment will lead to Cubanization of Peru and proceeded with caution. Nixon sent a representative to deal with the question of the IPC without success. When the Peruvian Navy captured American fishing boats in its territorial waters, Nixon cut off military aid and suspended the sale of arms to Peru. In reprisal, the Peruvian government expelled the United States military mission and denied entry to the Rockefeller Commission, which was on a Latin American tour on Nixon's behalf. Velasco Alvarado's foreign policy was pro-Third World, independent, and open. He tightened relations with communist countries. In 1971, he restored relations with Cuba and led a regional movement to persuade the OAS to lift the sanctions imposed on Cuba in 1964. In 1974, Peru joined the non-aligned movement. In 1975, a worldwide recession caused the price of Peru's export products to fall, reducing its exports and throwing the nation into a grave economic crisis. Its foreign debt, the fiscal deficit, and inflation skyrocketed. Contradicting his third world rhetoric, Velasco submitted to the requirements of the International Monetary Fund. This crisis triggered popular mobilizations, union protests, and strikes, which the government declared illegal. A police strike left Lima without police control, resulting in the looting of many stores and commercial centers. The strike was harshly put down. Border conflicts with Ecuador and Chile in July and August 1975 added to the tension. Unhappy with the situation, the military forced Velasco to resign. On August 29th, he left the presidential palace alone with no announcement to the people of Lima. He left behind a new Peru, having turned the country upside down. He had favored the masses and reduced power of the oligarchy, but the grave economic, social, and political difficulties that affected the entire country opened the floodgates to the opposition from the left as much as from the right. No one was happy. His successor, General Francisco Morales Bermudez, 1975 to 1980, buried the Nasserite Revolution, and the country returned to its old ways. The change of the president marked the end of an extraordinary experience managed by progressive military officers with a social conscience, which aroused great hopes among the Peruvian masses was widely admired beyond the nation's borders. Venezuela, the birth of democracy. Romulo Betancourt, the leader of the Democratic Action Party, AD, a party of the masses, was elected president of Venezuela in 1959 to 1964 with the massive support of the people. He was a liberal figure of continent-wide stature and was considered one of the wisest and most brilliant politicians of his time. He was the first civilian president after a long period of bloody, brutal, and corrupt military dictatorships. His arrival marked the birth of democracy. Betancourt had to contend not only with the surge of a powerful guerrilla movement in the cities and the mountains, but also intense social unrest, a serious economic crisis, military uprisings, and attempted coups by rightist military officers nostalgic for dictatorship. There had been bitterness among the leftist movements, marginalized in spite of the fact that the patriotic junta promoted by the Communist Party led to the fall of Perez Jimenez's dictatorship. The junta was made of the Betancourt Party, Democratic Alliance AD, the Committee of Independent Political Electoral Organization, COPE, and the Democratic Republic Union, URD. Amid the euphoria at the tyrant's fall, the communists ordered the popular forces to postpone their social struggle until the constitutionality was restored and the president was elected by popular vote. They were so dazzled by the triumph of democracy that they did not negotiate for the representation in the government, according to one former activist. We did not see that the usual political birds of prey were looking for the seats of power, he said. With a certain bitterness, Pompeo Marquez, one of the 5 leaders of the insurrection, recalled, "While we were running through the stadium shouting harsh hurrahs for liberty, the dominant sectors were running to Miraflores, the presidential palace, to take over the government." The courageous days of the popular struggle during January 1958, when the people, led by the communists, took to the streets to confront the police and the army, were a thing of the past. In the end, they were left empty-handed. Betancourt, an anti-communist to the core, was also excluded them. Even from exile before the fall of Perez Jimenez, he warned that he would have nothing to do with the communists. They were not part of his government coalition called Fixed Point, in which only the AD, URD, and COPE were represented. Social violence and repression began in the early months of his government. The country was suffering a recession, fiscal crisis, depleted reserves, a fall in oil prices, a budget deficit, and high unemployment. Betancourt responded to the economic crisis with drastic and profoundly unpopular emergency measures. He reduced salaries at first in Venezuela, laid off thousands of public employees, raised taxes, and eliminated the emergency plan that had developed by a civilian military junta, the first government following the dictatorship, to help the unemployed. A demonstration by unemployed workers in the Plaza de la Concordia in Caracas in August 1959 to protest Betancourt's laws was dispersed with police gunfire, leaving 4 dead and several wounded. The violent repression against the lower classes and the unemployed, the Betancourt's alliance with the oligarchy, his invitation to foreign capital, his anti-communist and anti-Cuban policies, and his hostility toward the left radicalized the lower classes unemployed, generating a strong movement in opposition to the government. In April 1960, an important sector of the AD youth withdrew to found the Marxist-Leninist movement of the revolutionary left, MIR. In July, Jovito Villabala, the head of URD, resigned from the Fixed Point Coalition because he disagreed with Betancourt's internal and foreign policies and supported the Cuban Revolution. A military uprising was staged in April 1960 amid this highly charged atmosphere. It was led by General Castro Leon, the Minister of Defense under the previous government. Though it was put down 4 days later, there was an assassination attempt on Betancourt. An OAS commission determined that the attempt was the work of the Dominican dictator Generalissimo Rafael Trujillo. In November, there was a gigantic pro-government demonstration by campesinos and workers, but the clashes between the government and the people continued. Student demonstrations at university and secondary schools were met with violent police confrontation, leaving many wounded and dead. The MIR newspaper demanded a change of government. Betancourt, in turn, ordered a series of arrests of journalists and deputies allied with the MIR because he believed that they were instigating a coup. In January 1961, the economic situation began to improve with a rise in oil prices, Venezuela's principal export in foreign markets. But the political situation grew more complex with more military uprising. In February, right-wing officers tried to take over the military college and the barracks of the Presidential Guard, and in June a takeover was tried at Pedro Mario Freitas barracks. Both actions failed. In January 1962, there were massive popular protests, among them one of the transportation workers, which reached unprecedented proportions. In June and July, there were new military uprisings, this time by progressive officers in La Guerra, Carpuana, and Puerto Cabello. Though they failed, they did succeed in causing a great stir among the people and deep concerns for the government. After these failed attempts, a contingent of ranking officers created the Armed Forces of National Liberation, FALN, and began the armed struggle. Young people of the left, the Communist Party, the MIR, and the RRD went into the mountains. Analysts defined Betancourt's government as constitutional but anti-democratic. His extreme anti-communism led him to undertake severe repression of the guerrillas, communists, and lower-class sectors. The violence in Venezuela in the 1960s coincided not by chance, I imagine, the former commandant Alfredo Manero conjectured, with a decade of violence throughout Latin America. The detonator of this explosion was the Cuban Revolution. The situation in the country improved during the final years of Betancourt's government. The economy was slowly improving, and the support for the government grew with the passage of the agrarian reform law and the distribution of the lands in the conflict zones and the resulting jolt to industry and the new oil policies. Betancourt promised greater participation by the state, changed the rules on concession on foreign companies, and created the Venezuelan Petroleum Corporation to manage this primary sector of its economy. But Betancourt's repression of the left and his anti-Cuban politics elicited explosive protests from the people and discomfort among the military. The demonstrations in defense of the Cuban Revolution, which brought together the masses, students, and intellectuals, were violently suppressed. Only Betancourt and the police are against the feelings of the people. Some commented Lubin Petkov, one of the most distinguished former guerrilla leaders. Betancourt's foreign policy was firm, consistent, and upright. He is remembered as one of the most fervent defenders of democracy, tenacious in his opposition to the dictators Trujillo and Somoza and de facto government. He insisted that the OAS take measures to defend democratic principles and expel the dictatorships for going against the inter-American system. In a letter to President Kennedy in July 1963, he declared that he was burdened by worry before the somber paranoia taking shape in Latin America, and he reminded Kennedy of his words in defense of democratic values. Betancourt severed diplomatic relationships with the dictatorships of Trujillo in the Dominican Republic, Colonel Lopez Arellano in Honduras, and Francois Duvalier in Haiti. After the military coup against Peruvian President Manuel Prado Ugarte, Betancourt requested a meeting of the OAS's consultative organ to condemn this deed. And when the Brazilian military toppled João Goulart, he asked Latin American governments to refuse to recognize the new government. The OAS confirmed that the assassination attempt in 1960 was indeed the work of Trujillo. Venezuela succeeded in getting the organization to impose sanctions on the dictator and persuading the member governments to cut off diplomatic relations. Betancourt was also a determined opponent of the Cuban Revolution and one of Fidel's biggest critics. He granted no credit to Cuba for the purchase of oil, and he supported the United States policies against Cuba in the United Nations and the OAS. At the OAS, he accused Cuba of trying to sabotage the Maracaibo oil fields and of interference in the internal affairs of Venezuela. The army captured a shipload of weapons that came from Cuba and discovered the presence of Cuban military personnel among the Venezuelan guerrillas. Though Betancourt had already left office in 1964, the OAS imposed economic and diplomatic sanctions on Cuba for these actions. Mexico, Chile, Uruguay, and Bolivia voted against them. Secretary of State Dean Rusk accused Cuba of trying to destroy Venezuelan democracy. It turned out that Fidel did lend economic support, weapons, advisors, and training to the Venezuelan guerrillas to help them overthrow Betancourt. At some point, there was talk that Che would get involved in the Venezuelan armed struggle, but the Venezuelan Communist Party opposed this plan. It would have enormously aggravated the Venezuelan revolutionary process and confirmed Betancourt's accusations that Castro communism was driving our insurgent movement. Lubin Petkov, the former guerrilla leader, commented later. Pompeo Marquez agreed, I would have completely distorted the national content of our struggle. Betancourt often denounced the exploitation of Venezuelan oil resources by United States transnational corporations and enacted measures to change the terms of the concession to the companies and raise their taxes. The corporations took steps in reprisal by means of market manipulations, which Betancourt had condemned. They lowered the price of crude oil. In 1960, at Venezuela's initiative, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, was created to unite the oil-producing countries, Venezuela and the Arab nations, that is, and to control the price of oil on the world market. From this position of strength, they could negotiate with the capitalist oil-consuming powers. Betancourt was repressive and rode roughshod over civil rights and on the one hand, but guaranteed democracy on the other. The most powerful sector of the country supported him. He was the first Venezuelan president to complete his term and hand over the reins of power to his successor, Raul Leoni, who was elected with 90% of the vote. The comandantes. Universities and the youth movements of the communist and leftist parties were the main support of the Venezuelan armed insurrection of the 1960s, the so-called decade of violence. Groups of professors and young people from the middle class banded together and went into the mountains where they created focus and filled their ranks with campesinos. The armed groups were part of Latin American revolutionary explosion. Not everyone who went in the mountains stayed there, for life in the open air was filled with danger and called for physical and mental toughness, especially from those who were accustomed to the comforts of the city. Some felt demoralized and wanted out as the number of defections grew. The comandantes who had called a halt to that trend. From that point forward, whoever wanted to leave was considered a deserter, and whoever asks out will be shot. Some were. The Venezuelan firing squad execution scandalized public opinion within the country and abroad and created profound discontent among the leftist movements and the guerrillas. Most of the guerrillas were campesinos. Elegido Sabata Magoya, a former comandante, commented that the majority of them were illiterate and lacked any military training or ideologic position. Some did not even know that the Communist Party existed, and they learned to read from Marxist literature. They joined the guerrillas because they wanted to fight, to be the army of the people. They were mountain people who feared the city, which they saw as a graveyard for the revolutionaries, noted Sabata. Campesinos were also caught in the ceasefire between the army and the guerrillas. The army tortured them, raped their wives and daughters, robbed them, and killed them. The army went on to supposed guerrilla zones and bombed them from planes and helicopters. The troops fought them with funnel and search and destroy operations. Many troops and murderous soldiers came to the Sierra and obliged us to withdraw, but we learned to outwit them, remembered Sabata. He stated that the guerrillas also harassed the campesinos. We went through the whole rural village and told them, if you go around talking nonsense, we will shoot you. We set up focos and began to spoil everything. There were deep conflicts within the leftist parties. Some sectors of the youth movement did not agree with the old leadership of the Communist Party, and controversies arose between the civilians accused of wanting to sabotage the armed struggle and the militarists, accused of wanting to take over the leadership of the party. Both sides acted in isolation. Their armed liberation included MIR, Marxist-Leninists, the Front Liberation Nationale, National Liberation Front, and the Tactical Combat Union, urban cells of the Communist Party. The Venezuelan guerrilla struggle was unlike Cuba's. These activists gained no ground. Instead, they lost in the political and military arena. We were on the bleak high plateau for Bricio Ojeda, Lubin Petkov, Lunar Marquez, and others. We were celebrating the anniversary of the Cuban Revolution, and we said to ourselves, Fidel arrived at Columbia Camp in a tank after 2 years, and we, after 3, are sitting up here on this rock with our dicks in our hands, commented former Commandante Pablo. It was frustrating to compare the Cuban triumph with their own struggle because that national unity policy in the name of constitutionality of which the Communist Party had been the leader seemed to make no sense. Here the mountains had given birth to a mouse, said Alfredo Manero. Why did the guerrillas fail? The former commandants recall an insurrection plagued by mistakes and internal conflicts. They blamed the focused strategy, naivete, adventurism, lack of planning, and haste. They also pointed to the political ambiguities of the Communist Party, the political and ideological conflicts at the heart of the leftist parties, the lack of unity among the leadership, directives given too late or outside the political context, the desire to copy foreign paradigms, and the attempt to imitate the Cuban example. They recognized that they had also made a grave error in judgment when they assumed that people would support the fight against the regular army, the bulwark of a popularly elected president, and the support of the establishment. The people did not give that support, primarily because they did not understand the movement. The parties and the guerrilla movements had not done political work among the masses. The Communist Party did not explain to them why they were fighting a constitutional government after having fought a 30-year dictatorship that violated that constitutionality. The commandantes had imposed directives without listening to the people, dedicated themselves to the armed struggle, and grown increasingly isolated. Several former commandantes declared that in 1962, Betancourt was on the point of failing because of the extreme weaknesses of his government. That he did not, however, was due to the guerrillas' mistakes. Had the military uprisings that occurred that year in La Guardia, Campano, and Puerto Cabello been conceived within a plan for general insurrection, with other simultaneous actions and constant leftist ideologies, he would have fallen. Politically, the insurgency mistakes and failures were serious. After a vigorous campaign to persuade people not to vote in the elections, there was a 90% turnout. When the guerrillas attacked a train carrying families and children at El Encanto, leaving several people wounded and dead, the country turned against them. The government ordered that the perpetrators be tried in a military court and arbitrarily punished the elected representatives from the Communist Party and the MIR, accusing them of having instigated the attack. They were imprisoned and their parties were outlawed. The Court of Justice approved these measures. Another serious misjudgment was the so-called Caracas Plan, conceived to strike an overwhelming blow to the government through confrontations with the police forces. A shipment of arms for the guerrillas was to arrive from Cuba. When the arms reached the coast near Falcon, so did the army. Years later, viewing these events in retrospect, several former commandantes expressed relief that these weapons had been seized. The seizure prevented an incalculable massacre of the people of the left. From one mistake to another, from one failure to the next, the insurgent movement faltered. The Caracas Plan was the final blow. The Communist Party lost strength in the union movements, in the guild organizations, among the campesino forces, and in the student, professional, and technical sectors. And it lost the majorities in the Congress it had succeeded in wresting from the government. Was this armed struggle justified? In the testimony of participants in the decade of violence contained in a collection of books published by the Central University of Venezuela, many former comandantes expressed frustration at having lost the revolutionary movement because of the failures and the errors that had been committed. The movement did not achieve political importance, nor did it compensate for the enormous sacrifices and efforts made. They insisted. For Petkov, the revolution was necessary. However, in all revolutionary processes, he remarked, the road to victory is strewn with defeats and failures, without which it would be impossible to advance. Pedro Ortega, former guerrilla, considered it to have been a backward movement in the Venezuelan Revolution, since it fractured the left, which was unable to reunite in time to put up a single viable candidate. Pompeo Marquez believed that his own greatest mistake was in contributing to the insurrection line. He felt that he had been correct in promoting a process of reflection, not limited to a simple change of tactics or a mere operational change, but as a path of intellectual, theoretical, and political iniquity in an effort to form a fundamental ideology for a revolutionary future. For Monero, the time of violence was canceled out. The task is at hand, being not to blow on the coals, but to gather the wood for the fire that is coming. The Venezuelan guerrillas received underground aid from Cuba, the Soviet Union, China, Algeria, Albania, and Italy. These allies provided funds, weapons, training, and some advisors, among them Arnoldo Ochoa Sanchez, who became a star among the Cuban High Military Command and led his troops in Angola. He was later executed for his involvement in a serious narcotics trafficking scandal. It was a war funded by many outside his homegrown resources, according to former Comandante Luis Correa. But there was corruption and embezzlement in this clandestine traffic of arms and funds for the arms struggle. Some of those sent abroad on purchasing missions remained in Europe, living like pashas. The Communist Party used these funds to sustain its bureaucracy and not for the arms struggle for which they were earmarked. In 1966, Petkov received direct assistance from Fidel, who sent 15 men rather than 100 Petkov had requested. If they kill you, Fidel noted, 100 Cubans will be stranded in unknown territory, empty-handed and alone. They will be seen as intruders. The Cubans arrived on July 24th on the birthday of Liberator Simon Bolivar, after whom the operation was named. The men brought with them tremendous experience and arms. Little by little, Petkov's group was joined by other guerrilla detachments. We were 70-some, remembered Sabata, well-armed bunch. All veterans. This was a column made to strike, to take large towns, but nothing was done. We arrived at the rural villages, and there was eating and dancing and screwing around. We only mounted 3 or 4 operations to satisfy the people's anxiety. At first, Cuba gave restricted aid to the Venezuelan guerrillas, while the Venezuelan Communist Party fed them a pack of lies so they would not suspend that aid, remembered Comandante Luis Correa. They told Fidel that they had already had a mountain army and that armed struggle was going well, and they showed him maps of liberated zones. They told him similar lies to the Communist parties of Korea, China, and Vietnam. Quarrels erupted between the Cubans and the Venezuelan Communist Party when the latter proposed a policy of withdrawal. Comandantes Douglas Bravo promised that he would keep on fighting, and the Cubans supported him. At one point, his column had the best arms, best men, and the best Cuban advisors. Later on, the Cubans became disillusioned with Bravo. Fidel lined up against the Venezuelan Communist Party. Given his moral stature, his attacks were shattering, since his criticism made them look like cowards, according to one former commandante. Cuba severely criticized the withdrawal, for it represented a serious setback in its revolutionary plans for Latin America. Che was already in Bolivia, ready to put a match to the fuse in a continent-wide revolution. Had the Cuban leadership betrayed him, as some comandantes maintained, the lies by the Venezuelans hurt the Cubans, although some held that Cuba provided aid because the most important thing at the moment was to encourage revolutionary fervor, however incipient it may have been. Cuba's change of policy with respect to the Venezuelan guerrillas, they said, must be seen in the international context, bearing in mind Cuba's growing dependence on Moscow, Khrushchev's policy of peaceful coexistence with the West, and the Soviet Communist Party's opposition to armed struggle. Moscow did not agree with Cuba's assistance to Latin American insurgent movements. The help Fidel provided Douglas Bravo and Petkov was the last small effort he made to see if the lies were true. He stopped only when he could no longer do it. Leone's pacification. When Raul Leone assumed the presidency in 1964 to 1969, the insurrection movement was all but wiped out, and there was a sense of peace. The Venezuelan Communist Party decreed a unilateral truce so the president could develop plans for peace offered in his campaign. Letter proposed later proposed a democratic peace, a policy approved by the party plenum in spite of its internal discrepancies. Finally, it decreed the withdrawal. Leone's pacification policy was one of extreme repression and offered amnesty to former activists. And the police raided universities and detained hundreds of students and leftist party activists. Some were assassinated or disappeared, their corpses found horrifically tortured. Under this policy of extermination, the insurgent movement started to wither away. After Leone, the head of COPE, Rafael Caldera, was elected to office, the road was paved for a succession of constitutional presidents elected by popular vote. Coups and militarism became the thing of the past. From this point forward, the candidates from the social and political elite of the two biggest parties, COPE and Acción Democrática, succeeded one another without incident. Betancourt, Leone, and Caldera, Democrats of principle and ideas, did not seem to have the moral or ethical scruples about violating human rights and negating constitutional guarantees. They justified their actions by claiming that their priority was to defend democratic institutions against the communist threat. All sectors of power supported them. The former guerrillas that entered the national or political arena with obstacles or threats on the lives, thus enjoying the privileges of a country with a democratic vocation, open to the play of politics and to change. The party's over. In Latin America, the 1960s went from revolutionary turbulence to the virtual elimination of armed insurgencies. Only the Montoneros and the ERP in Argentina and the Tupamaros in Uruguay continued their activities at full throttle. The motivations, objectives, processes, and boom times of the armed struggles and the reasons for their dissolution were similar, though their effectiveness and impact were not. Some produced widespread internal shocks and tremors, but constituted no real threat to their governments. Contrary to Cuba's situation, where the armed struggle went up against a corrupt and bloody dictatorship, and the Southern Cone, where the insurgents fought the neo-fascist dictatorships, revolutionaries in Colombia, Peru, and Venezuela were fighting against constitutional governments of the so-called democratic renaissance. The end of the decade was a celebration for the counterinsurgency, which served the United States defense strategy and the national security doctrine. Washington continued to support the dictatorship, and Nixon arrived in the White House with his eyes fixed on Chile, where the socialist Salvador Allende governed. Later, he began decisive and extensive clandestine intervention. So that's it. That's chapter 5, weapons in hand, masters of war. I'm going to make some comments, just, 5-10 minutes. Basically, revolutions on the continent. We started with Che Guevara, the revolution in Bolivia. He was trying to, promote democracy in Bolivia, equality in Bolivia. The U.S. terrorist government, the racist terrorist government in the United States of America, and the CIA murdered him. This typical thing, murder by the U.S. government, not a bone of democracy in their body. It's a fascist group of mafia, gun-violent thugs with nuclear weapons. That's what the United States amounts to, a gun-violent group of thugs, terrorist whites with nuclear weapons. That's what they are. Militarism uprising, basically the strategy was the military aid to Latin America. Millions of dollars were given by the CIA and FBI to train the Latin American national security doctrine, that was proposed by the United States government to all the South American, Latin American countries. Brazil was a center of experimentation with sophisticated torture that was taught by American agents that spread to other countries, many countries, horrible torture by the terrorist whites of the U.S. Congress and its presidents. Argentina opened fire. We learned about the Frondizi. We first learned about Frondizi, who was anti-imperialist, nationalist, and leftist. He did very well during his term. He did very well, if you consider. But unfortunately, the problems that happened were a result of economic issues. Probably it was induced by the terrorist whites of Washington. They wanted poverty in Latin America to overthrow these democratic governments. And so they created changes in the monetary funds and the World Bank and all sorts of changes, fraud, statistical changes in their, financial, quote unquote, capitalist system of, racist terror is what it is. And they probably, had him overthrown he started to decline because of money and economics. The military, ended up, basically, he was at odds with the military and oligarchy, and he was very much in support of labor. Basically, he was a third world pro candidate. So we should remember, Frondizi, Che Guevara was his ally. Fidel Castro was his ally. He was Argentina's first elected leader, and his name was Arturo Frondizi, a top level person, but unfortunately, he had some repression, and that was, understood. Then came Artur Ilya, who won the 1963 elections. And, after the overthrow of Frondizi, Arturo Ilya won the elections. He was a doctor. He broke with the World Bank, also someone who was interested in progress. He was the second president. Again, the U.S. government kept the, poverty going in Latin America. They are terrorist whites of Washington with nuclear weapons, a group of terrorist, gun-violent whites with nuclear weapons. And so Arturio's policies, nationalistic policies, ended up, creating a problem for him. And, there was a coup against him that was finally, he fell as a result of a coup. Carlos Ongania, was also a legalist and opposed the coup, was placed in the presidency by the military. He was work stoppage. He was one of the first that, imposed a government that was much more repressive. He was much more repressive. He saw, reaction to the discontent of the economic crisis. His name was Tyranny Elite, and the subsequent growing in unemployment and repression of the working class and students by Engaño's Dicta Blanda, or Tyranny Light. So that was him. Basically, General Aramburu was kidnapped. And basically the leaders, the Lanús had toppled him. Lanús, the general of the army. So then the Montoneros came into Argentina. In no other Latin American country except Cuba, have the guerrillas shaken the country as in Argentina. And Argentina was a great place for revolutionary fervor. It stayed in power throughout the Argentine history and, followed the United States terrorists, to completion. They removed the terrorist whites of Washington from Argentina influence. That is a fact, and it will stay that way. The terrorist whites of Washington have been extricated from Argentina's bureaucracy and democracy. So continuing on, the Argentina, they admired Castro. The armed movements were, multiple. The Montoneros and the ERP are the major armed movements that are important in this. We saw all of the armed movements. Perón was the next person we discussed. Basically, Montoneros was an organization that was looking out for the people. They kidnapped many government people. They created a huge problem for the military in Argentina, and they were never directly, taken care of. The U.S. could not directly take care of them, no matter how many guns and napalm and chemical weapons, nuclear weapons, and biological weapons they supply to the South Americans and Latin American states. They will never take care of the ERP and the Montoneros. Perón's return of Argentina was, he was he was like a right winger. He was, basically, they were, basically, it was a youth movement, welcomed him with massive demonstrations. Basically, Perón was, after going and being in exile, he changed his tune and, basically became more right wing. And that was, not what the peasants wanted. The priests, had to break with the clergy. Remember the powerful military, the Vatican, the racist, murderous butchers of the United States and their Vatican fascist priests, we remember, were powerful in reactionary hierarchy of the Argentine church, blind and mute to their grave violations of human rights, supported the military regimes and identified with the interests of the oligarchies. They branded the communists as atheists, and they were, very, careful or scared of the third world churches. And so, the Archbishop of Buenos Aires prohibited the involvement in politics. But basically the group, broke with, the church hierarchy and undermined its authority. So the Argentine church broke with the Vatican and the church of the European fascists, and kept its own Christian value systems. Brazil and the military guerrillas. We learned about Brazil in the United States penetration of Brazil. Castillo Branco was promoted by the terrorist white of Washington, U.S. Congress, as well as President Johnson. A coup in which he was illegally, providing a naval, murderous campaign. And, Brazil was supplied with hundreds of U.S. officers that were present on their land. The terrorist American government kept military officers in Brazil against international law and against the will of the people. But that is, nothing new for Washington. They break international law and they break the will of the people at any notice because they are vicious white thugs. So continuing on, the Brazilian insurgency kept going. Castelo Branco, we talked pretty much about the military dictatorship. We talked about Castelo Branco. Then there was Emilio Garrastazu Medici. He came to power. He was brutally repressive. Medici, you should remember him as a brutally repressive regime. Interrogations, torture was commonplace, murder, assassination, kidnappings, the like. There were huge numbers of, torture centers in Brazil. It became kind of a fetish of the U.S. government. It was a fetish to torture the Latin American Hispanic people. That's the U.S. government's racist fetish of whites of Washington. So the insurgency also took place. The military took, power violently in Brazil, but they had a guerrilla struggle. It was a huge struggle against the military, and most of the issues became much more worsened because of the military's repressive status. There were kidnappings, capture of arms, attacks on American institutions. Basically, everyone knew that America was behind the terrorist fetish of torture of Latin Americans. Fetish white torture of Latin Americans. They loved the Hispanic torture, the U.S. terrorist whites of Washington. Kidnappings, were commonplace. But unfortunately, the Brazilian, military generals, with the help of Washington, infiltrated. And, it was too powerful an organization of entrenched deception and murder that caused them to keep from, doing anything. Then there was the Liberation Church, and then, the Liberation Church, the dirty war, we call Brazil the dirty war of impunity, military class, general amnesty, the churches, all of them reveal the victims of murder by the U.S. government, the church priests of South America, the Latin America. The Archdiocese of San Pedro compiled a secret book in which he documented all the murders by the U.S. government of the priests in Latin America, in Brazil. Uruguay, we talked a lot about the greatness. Uruguay, you should remember it as one of those lands of egalitarianism and democracy. It is a land that started democratic, a very small country with a population of 2.5 million, was always an oasis of peace and democracy. It never had any problems. Its government was, basically led by the Tupamaros, and, Pacheco. Pacheco was, the first elected, President Justido, 1967, was, died in 1967. He was the first president, after the brief dictatorship. And then, Oscar Justido in 1966 won the election. And then he died in 1967. And then Pacheco Areco, another, former journalist, continued, he basically caused, prestigious intellectuals, permanent state of siege was imposed. And he proceeded to lead the country into a de facto dictatorship, which the people called a constitutional dictatorship. And he strengthened presidential power, and that was a repressive thing. That was the first time in 1967, as the finances started to, get paralyzed. Basically, strikes by unions, employees, and massive demonstrations were put down by force. by, the Uruguayan government and its American allies. Uruguay was drawn into the IMF, so we know how the IMF, murdered the people of Uruguay, and that's, basically once the IMF gets involved, that's the U.S. government's way of torturing the people and murdering the people, the terrorist whites of Washington. And then Chez showed us the way, basically the the Che Bolivian Revolution was used as the Tupamaros, way. They were a very powerful group. They basically kidnapped Dan Mitron, the Brazilian torturer and Uruguayan torture police, representative. They murdered him, and, multiple kidnappings, all good things, good deeds done by the Tupamaros, a very, egalitarian organization, good people, responding to Washington terrorism. So continuing on, we had the Colombian Revolution. Colombia was again right wing. We talked about all of the presidents of Colombia. Colombia and Cuba were at odds throughout the history. Valencia was pacified. Valencia pacification theory, and then basically, the government was in 1970. Rojas Pinilla was defeated by a conservative by a ridiculously narrow margin, and he ended the years of Colombia. It was a right-wing dictatorship, highly repressive, anti-communist, pro-murder, pro-repression, the standard thing, U.S. government, national security doctrine. Peru, decline of the oligarchy. Basically, Peru was led by Ugarteche in the 1960s. Because of severe political crisis, as was seen in all of Latin America, probably due to U.S. terrorism of economic, manipulations, Peru became, embroiled in a capitalist crisis. Basically they had a huge, amount of, change. They were trying to get change. Bolondi was the president. He was, put in change. And then the insurgency of the 1960s, the Peru's economic situation, and the culture was a culture medium of revolutionary struggle. But the repression, student movement, intellectual and leftist forces continued to fight for political and democratic openings. They followed the Soviet-Chinese ideologic context, and basically, many rebel groups merged. And then the Latin Naserites were the military officers of the revolutionary government, were progressive, nationalist, anti-imperialist, and anti-oligarchy. And these were Naserites, so different from the continent's military dictatorships. The government did keep order by force. It was not repressive. And so the government of Peru was much more, less, murderous than, the Brazilian dictatorship of the United States. Basically, that was it. And, I recommend you reread it. Now we get to Venezuela. Venezuela is an important government, Romulo Betancourt. The oil of Venezuela is the key. The U.S. government, terrorist whites of Washington are mafia thugs. They stole the oil in Venezuela during Betancourt's term. He tried to nationalize the oil, and he came into direct conflict with the U.S. terrorist capitalists. And, basically, the terrorist capitalists, put him into trouble, and then he was forced to, get out of office. Basically he organized the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, was created at the bequest of Venezuela to control the oil market because they were being, repressed by the U.S. government. The Betancourt often denounced the exploitation of Venezuelan oil resources by United States transnational corporations and enacted measures to change the terms and concessions of these companies and to raise their taxes. The corporation took steps to reprisal. Market manipulation by the U.S. government, which Betancourt condemned, lowered the prices of crude oil, making it difficult for Venezuela to make a profit on their oil. The standard thing, the terrorist whites of the U.S. government manipulate cash, manipulate finances, murder the Hispanic people. They are anti-Hispanic and anti-third world butchers. So finishing up, that's pretty much it. Comanditas, Venezuela, pretty much the party's over. That's it. So 3 hours, unfortunately, it was a long chapter, Masters of War, U.S., Latin America and U.S. aggression from the Cuban Revolution through the Clinton years. Please download the book at the description section of the website. So we're going to finish up real quick. with some closing remarks. Please download the Google Drive link in the description section. The book will be a PDF. We continue chapter 4, the backyard. The U.S. government deceitful frauds and their deceitful white press paint Franklin Delano Roosevelt, president from 1933 to 1945, as a person with open door policy who was interested in opening America up to the people and businesses. Actually, Mr. Roosevelt was a terrorist butcher, one of a brutal string of American butchers who waged some of the most vicious campaigns in Latin America. This racist kept Rafael Trujillo in power and also was a good friend with brutal dictator Tacho Somoza. Roosevelt was responsible, actually, for the overthrow of the democratic leader of Nicaragua, Juan Sacasa, whom he did not support. And in 1937, Juan Sacasa was overthrown by Somoza as a result of Roosevelt's murderous butchery. Roosevelt's intervention in Latin America was hardly acknowledged or discussed by the white frauds of American media or government as a way of secretly hiding his criminal actions. His most important intervention was the money and approval he gave to the murderous dictator of Cuba, Batista, who slaughtered his people and provided United States penetration of Cuba economically and took over those sugar plantations of Cuba and kept the people in a state of racist slavery. He also gave hundreds of millions of dollars of weapons to Tachado Somoza, the oldest Somoza, starting in 1933, and kept him waging war and murder against the people of Nicaragua. He is one of the most brutal butchers of the American government. We also talked about Guatemala, where the U.S. government formed a colonial slave state and starved the people with mass murder and repression, including imprisonment and fascist torture. The major president and figure in this were Eisenhower and Dulles, racist white mafia thugs with nuclear weapons that removed the only leaders who stopped slavery of the Guatemalan people. Juan Arevalo and Jacobo Arbenz, and waged a vicious military incursion against international law and against the government of Guatemala. This was the effective end of Guatemala, as it was reduced to a bloodbath of orgy and slavery, murder and torture by the U.S. government. El Salvador, we should remember General Carlos Humberto Romero, 1977 to 1979, who waged a vicious campaign against the peasants using American money and military napalm burning and poisons and other terrorism and technology that was supplied by the white terrorists of Washington. He was funded by the racist butcher of Washington, Carter, the anti-Hispanic butcher who sliced infants into pieces with machetes and had nursing infants grabbed from mothers and thrown into the air for target practice with machine gun fire. Nicaragua was discussed previously, and Carter was again the butcher that funded and kept the murderous assassin Anastasio Somoza in power 1976 to 1979 and supplied him with bombs, genocidal hardware, napalm, radars, and the like. Honduras history, we remember the massacres of Lopez Arellano, 1963 to 1971, in which Johnson backed the murderous butcher in mass murdering his people and marked the age of brutal repression, including massacres, imprisonment of political prisoners, and open murder. He maintained the people of Honduras in a state of slavery and abject misery. Again, we continued with weapons in hand, a recount of American butcher wars in Latin America and repressive colonial fascism. So that's it. Krishna Iyer with the Iyer Think Tank in Delray Beach. Join me tomorrow for another 1.5 chapters, another 50 pages, about hopefully 2.5 hours tomorrow. Glad you could join us. Have a great day. Delray Think Tank.